Part 3, the Post-Corporate Transition District. The Architecture of Arrival. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. May 25, 2026. Part 3. The Architecture of ARRIVAL Chapter 12. 2 Operating Systems. 1 Territory. Every community that has ever attempted to build itself around a transformative purpose, every intentional settlement, every utopian experiment, every creative colony, every frontier ecosystem, every community organized around the proposition that a different kind of life is possible and worth building, has encountered, at some point in its development, a version of the same fundamental problem. The problem is not ideological disagreement, though ideological disagreement is common and often destructive. It is not resource scarcity, though resource scarcity is a constant pressure and frequently the proximate cause of a community's collapse. It is not the failure of the founding vision, though founding visions are almost always inadequate in some dimension to the complexity of the reality they are attempting to organize. The fundamental problem, the one that underlies and amplifies all the other problems, the one that is least often named correctly because it is least often recognized as a structural feature of the community's situation rather than a collection of individual failures and personal incompatibilities, is the failure to design for the full range of psychological states in which people arrive. Communities organized around transformative purpose attract people in radically different stages of their own transformation. They attract the fully convinced and the tentatively curious. They attract the operationally experienced and the aspirationally naive. They attract the people who have already done the internal work that the community's program is designed to support and the people who have not yet begun it. They attract the people who have survived previous attempts at the kind of life the community is proposing and who carry, in their survival, a specific and hard-won knowledge about what works and what doesn't, and the people who have never attempted anything comparable and who carry, in their inexperience, an enthusiasm and an openness that the experienced person has often lost. They attract, in other words, people who are operating on fundamentally different psychological platforms, people whose relationship to the community's purpose, whose readiness for the community's demands, whose capacity for the community's specific kind of engagement, and whose specific needs from the community's infrastructure differ so substantially that any single approach to their integration will serve some of them adequately and fail the rest. The communities that handle this diversity well, that convert the full range of arriving psychological states into a productive ecosystem rather than a source of friction and attrition, share a specific design feature that the communities that handle it poorly almost uniformly lack. They have thought carefully and honestly about the diversity of arriving states and have designed their integration architecture explicitly for the full range rather than for an idealized arriving member who represents the community's preferred participant profile. The communities that handle it poorly, and the history of intentional communities, creative colonies, and frontier ecosystems is substantially a history of communities that handled it poorly, have typically made one of two opposite errors. The first error is to design the community for the initiated, for the people who already share the community's operating assumptions, already possess the capabilities the community requires of its members, already understand the vocabulary and the practices and the cultural norms that define the community's identity, and to receive the uninitiated with a mix of impatience and incomprehension that produces attrition among exactly the people who, with appropriate integration support, would become the community's most valuable long-term contributors. The second error is to design the community for the uninitiated, to calibrate the entire program and culture of the community to the needs and the capacities of the least experienced arriving members, in an impulse of democratic inclusivity that inadvertently produces a community whose culture is too thin and too undemanding to retain the initiated practitioners who would give the community its operational depth and its cultural authority. Both errors are fatal in different ways and at different speeds to the community's long-term viability. The community designed exclusively for the initiated produces a culture of insider excellence that is genuinely impressive in its operational quality and genuinely hostile in its social texture. A community that performs its own competence with a fluency that is inspiring to observe from a distance and alienating to encounter up close if you have not already arrived at the level of competence the community implicitly requires. This culture produces a founding cohort of remarkable density and quality and a permanent incapacity to grow beyond that founding cohort, Because every arriving person who is not already at the founding cohort's level of operational experience and cultural literacy is received as someone who does not fully belong and who must prove belonging before they are welcomed, rather than being welcomed as someone whose potential belonging is itself an asset worth cultivating. The community designed exclusively for the uninitiated produces a culture of enthusiastic openness that is genuinely welcoming in its social texture and genuinely shallow in its operational content. A community in which everyone's journey is honored and everyone's contribution is celebrated, and the honest, demanding, uncomfortable feedback that genuine development requires is withheld in the name of psychological safety, until the community's initiated practitioners, starved of the operational depth that makes their participation worthwhile, depart in search of environments that take their capabilities seriously, and the community is left with a dense population of enthusiastic beginners and no one with the experience to guide them through the difficult phases of the transformation they came to undertake. The transition district cannot afford either error. It cannot afford the first because its long-term viability depends on the continuous integration of new arrivals, on its capacity to receive people at every stage of the post-institutional transition and to support their development through the full arc from arriving disorientation to operational sovereignty, and therefore on its capacity to design for the full range of arriving states rather than for the narrow band of states that the initiated community implicitly requires. It cannot afford the second because its cultural authority, its claim to global recognition as the prototype for post-corporate civilization infrastructure rather than as a comfortable gathering of like-minded people in a beautiful place, depends on the density and the quality of the operational knowledge and the genuine practice of operational sovereignty that the initiated practitioners embody and transmit, and therefore on its capacity to retain and deploy initiated practitioners rather than losing them to environments that offer the depth and the demand that their experience has equipped them to engage with. The solution to this dilemma is not a compromise between the two errors, not a community culture calibrated to some middle point between the initiated and the uninitiated that serves neither fully. It is the explicit, deliberate design of two distinct but mutually enabling integration tracks, organized around the recognition that the initiated and the uninitiated are not 2 points on a single developmental spectrum but two different kinds of participants who bring different things to the community and who need different things from it, and whose difference is not an obstacle to the community's coherence but the source of its dynamic. The engine of the knowledge transfer, the mentorship, the cultural transmission, and the community formation that makes the transition district's ecosystem self-sustaining and self-renewing rather than dependent on external recruitment for its continued operation. The initiated, in the specific sense this handbook uses the term, are the people who have already navigated some significant version of the post-institutional transition, who have already passed through, in one form or another and with one degree or another of success and one degree or another of painful failure, the experience of operating outside the institutional framework that previously provided their social coordinates, temporal structure, performance feedback, community, and daily purpose. They know what it costs. They know what it produces. They know the specific failure modes, the premature launch, the creative paralysis, the community isolation, the financial miscalculation, the identity collapse, that are the most common points of breakdown in the transition, and they know this from the inside rather than from the outside, from the experience of having encountered these failure modes in their own trajectories rather than from the theoretical analysis of other people's trajectories. They may or may not have fully completed their own transition in the sense of having arrived at a stable, sustainable, fully functioning sovereign operating life. Many of the most valuable initiated practitioners are people who are still in the middle of their own ongoing transition, still building and iterating and adjusting their own sovereign architecture, but who have been in the transition long enough and honestly enough to have accumulated the specific operational knowledge that makes them useful to people who are earlier in the same process. The definition of initiated is not perfection of outcome. It is depth of honest experience. The initiated bring to the community three things that the community cannot produce without them and cannot replace with any alternative resource. The first is the cultural authority that genuine experience confers, the specific quality of credibility that belongs to the person who has lived through the thing being discussed rather than the person who has read about it or theorized about it or designed programs about it from a position of institutional comfort. This cultural authority is the primary instrument through which the transition district's culture maintains its commitment to operational honesty, its resistance to the temptation of the retreat industry's affirmational culture, its insistence on the specific, difficult, sometimes disappointing truth about what the transition actually costs and what it actually produces, rather than the inspiring but operationally useless version of that truth that motivational culture has commodified and distributed at scale. The cultural authority of the initiated practitioner is what keeps the community's conversation honest when the pressure to be inspiring rather than accurate is at its greatest, and it is a resource that can only be contributed by people who have earned it through the specific investment of having actually done the thing. It cannot be manufactured, purchased, or substituted by the most sophisticated theoretical understanding of the thing undone. The second thing the initiated bring is the specific knowledge of the failure modes, the detailed, granular, operationally precise understanding of the specific ways in which the most common transition strategies break down under the specific pressures of the specific conditions that the transitioning person is actually navigating. This knowledge is the most valuable single input into the dream validation framework that this handbook describes in Chapter 15, because the validation of a proposed life design against operational reality is only as good as the knowledge of the operational realities being validated against, and the knowledge of the failure modes is the most operationally critical component of that knowledge. The theoretical analyst can enumerate the potential failure modes of a sovereign publishing practice or a relocating creative enterprise or a post-corporate consulting model. The initiated practitioner can specify the exact point in the execution of the plan at which the failure typically occurs, the exact form that the failure takes, the exact signals that precede the failure and that, if recognized in time, allow the failure to be averted or its consequences to be managed. That specificity is the difference between a warning and a map, and the transition district's dream validation process requires maps rather than warnings. The third thing the initiated bring is the proof, the visible, embodied, daily demonstrated evidence that the transition is survivable, that operational sovereignty is achievable, that the specific combination of autonomous practice and community embeddedness and territorial commitment that the transition district proposes as the post-institutional life is not a theoretical ideal available only to people with unusual capabilities or unusual circumstances, but an actual life being actually lived by actual people who were, at an earlier point in their own trajectories, in conditions not substantially different from the conditions of the arriving uninitiated person who is observing their example. The proof of concept is the initiated practitioner's most important contribution to the community, because it addresses the uninitiated person's deepest uncertainty, the uncertainty not about whether the transition is desirable but about whether it is genuinely possible for someone like them, with their specific capabilities and their specific circumstances and their specific fears and their specific history of institutional dependency, in a way that no argument and no data and no inspiring narrative can address as effectively as the simple, available, daily observable evidence of someone for whom it is actually working. The uninitiated, in the specific sense this handbook uses the term, are the people who are arriving at the district in the earlier stages of their post-institutional transition, people who have registered the dissolution of the institutional contract, who have recognized the inadequacy of the available conventional responses to that dissolution, and who have moved toward the district in search of the transition infrastructure that no conventional response provides, but who have not yet passed through sufficient experience of operating outside the institutional framework to have developed the specific operational knowledge and the specific psychological resilience that the initiated practitioners carry. They are not, as this handbook has been careful to emphasize throughout, people of lesser capability or lesser ambition or lesser potential than the initiated. They are, frequently, people of greater formal credential and greater institutional achievement, people whose institutional careers were more successful, in conventional terms, than those of many initiated practitioners, which is precisely why the dissolution of the institutional framework has produced in them a more profound disorientation than it produced in people who were always somewhat ambivalent about the institutional framework and therefore somewhat less invested in its continued provision of their identity architecture. The depth of the disorientation is often proportional to the depth of the prior investment, and the depth of the prior investment is often proportional to the level of the institutional success, which means the most disoriented arrivals are sometimes the people with the most impressive institutional histories, and the most impressive institutional histories are precisely the ones that carry the most valuable operational experience once the disorientation has been worked through and the experience has been reframed in the vocabulary of sovereign practice. The uninitiated bring to the community three things that are as essential to its long-term health as the three things the initiated bring, and that are as unavailable from any alternative source. The first is the continuous renewal of the community's orientation toward its founding purpose. Communities organized around a transformative purpose face a specific and persistent internal threat that is the mirror image of the threat they face from the failure to retain their initiated practitioners. The threat of the community becoming so thoroughly practiced in its own operational logic that it loses its capacity for the genuine encounter with its own purposes that its founding period required. The initiated community, the community composed primarily or exclusively of people who have already completed the transition the community was built to support, is a community at risk of becoming a professional association rather than a transformative ecosystem, organized around the exchange of advanced operational knowledge among people who have already arrived rather than the support of genuine transformation among people who are in the process of arriving. The uninitiated arrival is the antidote to this drift. The person whose genuine encounter with the community's founding purpose, whose real disorientation, whose real uncertainty, whose real need for the specific support the community was built to provide, reminds the initiated practitioners of what the community is for and why the operational knowledge they have accumulated matters beyond the intrinsic interest of the operational problems it addresses. The uninitiated arrival makes the initiated practitioner's knowledge consequential in the most direct possible sense. By being the person for whom it is consequential, by being the specific human being in front of whom the knowledge becomes something more than expertise and becomes, instead, the specific answer to a specific person's specific urgent need. The second thing the uninitiated bring is what might be called fresh signal, the continuous update of the community's understanding of the current conditions of the post-institutional transition, as those conditions are evolving in the world beyond the district's geographic boundaries. The initiated practitioner's knowledge of the transition is, by definition, knowledge of how the transition worked for them at the time they were going through it, in the specific conditions that obtained at that time. Those conditions are not static. The AI displacement wave is accelerating. The specific forms of institutional dissolution are evolving. The specific failure modes of post-institutional practice are changing as the platforms and the markets and the regulatory environments that post-institutional practitioners operate within are changing. The arriving uninitiated person is the community's most direct connection to the current conditions of the transition, the person who can report from firsthand experience how the dissolution currently feels, what the current institutional responses to it look like and why they are insufficient, what the current landscape of post-institutional alternatives offers and what it lacks, and what specific support the current wave of transitioning professionals most urgently needs that the previous wave's experience may not have fully anticipated. This fresh signal is essential for the community's continued relevance and its continued effectiveness as a transition support infrastructure, because a community that is only capable of supporting the kind of transition that its founding cohort went through is a community whose usefulness will diminish as the conditions of the transition evolve and the incoming wave's specific needs diverge from the founding cohort's specific experience. The third thing the uninitiated bring is the resource that makes the community's culture self-sustaining rather than dependent on the continuous external recruitment of initiated practitioners, the potential to become initiated practitioners themselves. Every uninitiated arrival who successfully completes their transition, who moves through the full arc from arriving disorientation to operational sovereignty, supported by the community's infrastructure and guided by the initiated practitioner's knowledge, is a future initiated practitioner whose experience of the community's support infrastructure is the most credible possible testimony to the infrastructure's effectiveness. They are the community's living proof of concept for the next generation of uninitiated arrivals, performing the same function that the initiated practitioners performed for them, providing the embodied evidence that the transition is survivable, that the community support is genuinely effective, and that the specific kind of life the district is designed to produce is an actual life being actually lived rather than an aspiration that the community endorses without consistently delivering. The community that successfully converts a significant proportion of its uninitiated arrivals into initiated practitioners is the community that has achieved the recursive stability that this handbook identifies as the transition district's most important long-term structural achievement, the self-renewing ecosystem in which the output of one generation of the transition process is the input resource for the next generation, and the community's capacity to support transition grows with rather than depletes through the accumulation of transitions it has supported. The architecture for managing the relationship between these two kinds of participants, for creating the conditions under which each brings what they have to offer and receives what they need, without the needs of one group compromising the contributions of the other, is what this handbook calls the architecture of arrival. It is not a program, in the sense of a defined sequence of activities with scheduled stages and assessed outcomes. It is a cultural design, the design of the community's implicit norms, its explicit practices, its spatial organization, its temporal metabolism, and its governance structures in ways that make the productive relationship between the initiated and the uninitiated the natural default of the community's daily life rather than a deliberate achievement that requires continuous conscious management. The cultural design, like all good design, should be largely invisible in its operation, producing its intended effects through the ambient conditions of the community rather than through the explicit enforcement of rules and protocols that would be experienced as constraint rather than as the natural logic of the community's life. The cultural design of the architecture of arrival operates through several specific mechanisms, each of which contributes to a different dimension of the productive relationship between the initiated and the uninitiated. The first mechanism is spatial, the design of the community's physical spaces and their programmatic uses in ways that create natural opportunities for the initiated and the uninitiated to encounter each other in contexts that are conducive to genuine knowledge transfer rather than performative mentorship or inadvertent intimidation. The transition dinner is the most explicit expression of this mechanism, a deliberate spatial and social arrangement that puts initiated practitioners and uninitiated arrivals at the same table in a context. The shared meal, the structured but informal conversation, the absence of the institutional hierarchy that would otherwise organize the relationship between the experienced and the inexperienced, that makes genuine peer-to-peer knowledge transfer more natural than the hierarchical knowledge transfer of the classroom or the workshop. But the spatial mechanism operates beyond the transition dinner in the design of the community's daily life. The shared workspaces that put the initiated practitioner's visible daily practice in proximity to the uninitiated arrival's visible daily struggle, the common areas whose spatial design encourages the kind of lingering conversation that produces incidental mentorship without either party having to identify the conversation as mentorship, the weekly programming whose public nature makes the initiated practitioner's knowledge available to the uninitiated arrival in the context of collective engagement rather than individual consultation. The second mechanism is temporal, the design of the community's weekly and seasonal rhythms in ways that create natural moments of integration between the tracks of the initiated and the uninitiated, without collapsing the distinction between the tracks that makes each valuable for the other. The weekly metabolism serves this function in part. The Monday AI briefing and the Tuesday Sovereign Publishing Session and the Wednesday Parallel Civilization Night and the Saturday Atmosphere Night are spaces of collective engagement in which the initiated and the uninitiated participate together, their different levels of experience producing different contributions to the collective activity rather than requiring the collective activity to be calibrated to either level at the exclusion of the other. The Monday briefing is enriched by the initiated practitioner's ability to interpret the week's AI developments in the context of their own practice history and the uninitiated arrival's ability to bring to the discussion the fresh perspective of someone encountering the implications of the developments without the interpretive filters that experience sometimes hardens into assumption. The Wednesday Parallel Civilization Night is enriched by the initiated practitioner's ability to connect the speculative narratives to the operational realities of post-institutional practice and the uninitiated arrival's ability to bring to the speculative exercise the imaginative freedom of someone who has not yet had their imagination disciplined by the operational constraints that experience imposes. The third mechanism is narrative, the design of the community's self-description, its governing vocabulary, and its mythological content in ways that make both the initiated and the uninitiated legible as essential participants in the community's purpose rather than as stages in a developmental hierarchy in which the uninitiated are incomplete versions of the initiated. This is the most subtle and the most important of the architectural mechanisms, because the narrative framework within which the community understands and presents its own composition is the primary determinant of how the relationship between the initiated and the uninitiated is experienced by both, whether it is experienced as a hierarchy to be navigated or a partnership to be engaged, whether the uninitiated person experiences their own arriving disorientation as inadequacy or as the specific kind of genuine engagement with the community's founding purpose that makes their presence consequential rather than merely tolerated, and whether the initiated practitioner experiences the uninitiated arrival's need for support as a drain on their own productive capacity, or as the specific form of consequential contribution that gives their accumulated experience its fullest expression. The narrative framework this handbook proposes, in which the initiated are understood as continuity multipliers and the uninitiated as the source of the community's renewal and its fresh signal and its living proof of concept across generations of arrival, is designed specifically to produce the second of these experiences rather than the first. The continuity multiplier framing gives the initiated practitioner a role that is genuinely honored and genuinely demanding. Demanding not the performance of formal mentorship but the daily, embodied demonstration of the operational sovereignty that their experience has produced, which is more demanding than formal mentorship because it cannot be switched on for the scheduled session and switched off for the rest of the day, but is instead a continuous contribution to the community's culture. Through the quality of the daily practice that the initiated practitioner's presence makes visible and available. The renewal source framing gives the uninitiated arrival a role that is genuinely valued and genuinely specific, valued not as the grateful recipient of the initiated practitioner's wisdom, but as the person who makes the initiated practitioner's wisdom consequential by being the specific human need that the wisdom is in service of, and specific in the sense that the uninitiated arrival's particular history, particular capability, particular failure mode, and particular post-institutional aspiration are not generic instances of the uninitiated condition but the specific material with which the community's dream validation process works in each individual case. The fourth mechanism is governance, the design of the community's decision-making structures and cultural standards in ways that give the initiated practitioners the authority commensurate with their contribution without giving them the kind of gatekeeping power that produces the closed and exclusionary culture that the first of the two design errors generates. The initiated practitioners should have more influence over the community's cultural standards and operational practices than the uninitiated arrivals, because their deeper experience of the transition makes their judgment about what works and what doesn't more reliable and more relevant than the uninitiated arrival's judgment, which is based on aspirations rather than outcomes. But their influence should be expressed through the cultural authority of demonstrated practice rather than through the formal authority of institutional position, through the natural deference that genuine experience commands from people who are genuinely seeking honest guidance rather than through the enforcement of rules and norms that the initiated practitioners have the institutional power to impose. The distinction between cultural authority and institutional authority is the distinction between a community that is led by its most experienced members in the way that any genuinely meritocratic community is led by the people whose judgment has earned the trust of the people around them, and a community that is controlled by its most powerful members in the way that any hierarchically organized institution is controlled by the people whose institutional position gives them the power to determine the community's direction regardless of the quality of their judgment. The fifth mechanism is the most operationally specific and the one that most directly addresses the practical challenge of managing the relationship between the initiated and the uninitiated in the daily life of the community, the staged revelation protocol for the uninitiated arrival. This protocol is not a manipulation of the uninitiated arrival's experience of the community. It is not the withholding of information or the management of the arrival's perception to produce a desired response. It is the recognition that the uninitiated arrival's capacity to absorb and productively engage with the full operational reality of the transition district's purpose and the full demanding complexity of its community's culture is limited, in the early stages of their arrival, by the disorientation of the between state they are navigating, and that the community's genuine service to the uninitiated arrival is therefore to introduce that reality and that complexity at a pace commensurate with the arrival's developing capacity to engage with it rather than presenting it all at once in a form that overwhelms rather than informs. The staged revelation is not a condescension. It is a pedagogy, the specific form of pedagogical care that recognizes the difference between the information a person needs to receive and the information a person is currently capable of using, and that structures the delivery of information to optimize for the second rather than the first. The uninitiated arrival who has been in the district for a week does not need, in that first week, the full complexity of the dream validation framework's operational specifications. They need, in that first week, the atmospheric permission to be uncertain and the social safety of a community that will not penalize the expression of uncertainty, which is the foundation on which the capacity to engage with the dream validation framework will eventually be built. The uninitiated arrival who has been in the district for a month is ready for the introduction of the Dream Validation Framework's foundational concepts and the early iterations of the Friday Reality Stress Test that will, over subsequent months, develop their capacity for the specific kind of honest self-assessment that operational sovereignty requires. The uninitiated arrival who has been in the district for a quarter is ready for the fuller engagement with the operational specifics of sovereign practice, the economics, the publication infrastructure, the community governance, the specific failure modes and their antidotes, that the community's more experienced members can provide from the depth of their own tested experience. The staged revelation protocol is built into the weekly metabolism rather than imposed as an explicit curriculum on the arriving person. The Monday AI briefing is accessible and useful to the person in their first week in the district without requiring any prior knowledge of the community's culture or any prior experience of post-institutional practice. The Saturday Atmosphere Night is experientially rich and culturally orienting without requiring any prior investment in the community's programmatic life. The Wednesday Parallel Civilization Night is imaginatively engaging and creatively stimulating at whatever level of operational sophistication the participant brings to it. These are the entry points, the community's public face, accessible to the arriving uninitiated person without prerequisite or prior investment, producing value immediately while simultaneously generating the curiosity and the orientation that motivate the deeper engagement that follows. The Tuesday Sovereign Publishing Session requires more prior investment, some familiarity with the community's publishing philosophy, some existing or nascent project to bring to the production session, some capacity for the honest feedback that the session's output-first culture generates, and is therefore a natural second-stage engagement for the uninitiated arrival who has used the entry point programming to develop sufficient orientation to the community's culture to engage with its production-focused programming productively. The Friday Reality Stress Test requires the most prior investment, the sufficient development of a proposed life designed to bring to the stress test, the sufficient trust in the community's culture of honest feedback to submit the design to it without defensive deflection, the sufficient resilience to receive honest critique as useful information rather than personal attack, and is therefore a natural third-stage engagement for the uninitiated arrival who has passed through the earlier stages of the community's integration arc with sufficient depth to be ready for the full operational challenge of the validation process. The architecture of arrival, designed through these 5 mechanisms and expressed through the weekly metabolism and the community formation apparatus and the governance structures that the subsequent chapters of this handbook describe in detail, produces the community's most important long-term structural feature: the continuous, self-sustaining transfer of operational knowledge from the initiated to the uninitiated, producing a continuous supply of newly initiated practitioners who carry the knowledge forward into the next generation of the community's life while simultaneously contributing the fresh signal and the renewal and the proof of concept that the community needs from its uninitiated arrivals. This transfer is not the product of any formal mentorship program or any explicitly designed knowledge management system. It is the natural product of a community culture that makes the initiated practitioner's embodied knowledge continuously available through the daily practice that the community's spatial and temporal design makes visible, and that makes the uninitiated arrival's genuine need for that knowledge continuously present as the specific human context that gives the knowledge its purpose and its consequence. 2 operating systems, 1 territory. The territory is Aldea Zama. The operating systems are the initiated's sovereign practice, the daily demonstration of what a life built outside institutional scaffolding looks like when it has been constructed with honesty and patience and genuine operational capability, and the uninitiated's transition process, the daily engagement with the disorientation and the possibility and the specific demanding work of rebuilding an identity architecture from foundations that can stand without institutional support. These 2 operating systems do not compete for the territory. They complete each other. The initiated practitioner's practice is deepened by the uninitiated arrival's genuine encounter with the purposes it is demonstrating, and the uninitiated arrival's transition is supported by the initiated practitioner's embodied proof that the transition is possible, that the life being attempted is an actual life being actually lived, and that the community the arriving person is entering is not a collection of people who have agreed to believe the same hopeful things about the future but a community of people who have built, through different paths and at different speeds and with different degrees of difficulty and different specific failures along the way, the actual capacity for the actual sovereignty that the transition district's governing vocabulary proposes as the actual destination of the actual transition that the arriving person is actually in the process of making. 1 territory, 2 operating systems, 1 ecosystem. The design of the architecture of arrival is the design of the conditions under which these 2 things, the territory and the 2 operating systems, become a single living organism rather than a beautiful space inhabited by people who are doing different things without a common purpose that makes their difference productive rather than merely diverse. The organism is the transition district. The architecture of arrival is how the organism is grown rather than built, from the specific human material that the specific historical moment is providing, in the specific liminal territory that the specific convergence of first phase achievement and second phase opportunity has made available. The organism is not yet fully grown. The architecture of arrival is the design of the growing conditions. The growing conditions are what this part of the handbook is concerned with, in the detail and the operational precision that genuine growing conditions require. Part 3. The Architecture of ARRIVAL Chapter 13. The Initiated, Decompression and Redeployment. The initiated practitioner arrives at the transition district carrying something that is simultaneously the community's most valuable resource and the individual's most complicated burden: accumulated operational knowledge of what it actually costs to live outside institutional scaffolding, obtained through the specific and irreplaceable mechanism of having attempted it, failed at some of it, succeeded at some of it, adjusted continuously, and arrived at some version of a working sovereign. Practice whose working quality is the product of a sustained engagement with the specific operational realities that the theoretical analysis of post-institutional life consistently underestimates and the motivational culture of the retreat industry consistently misrepresents. This knowledge is the community's most valuable resource because it is the primary instrument of the dream validation process, the specific content that distinguishes honest operational assessment from optimistic projection, and because it is the proof of concept that makes the uninitiated arrival's transition psychologically possible rather than merely theoretically conceivable. It is the individual's most complicated burden because it carries, embedded in the knowledge of what works, the specific memories of what failed, and those memories are not neutral data points in an operational database but lived experiences of genuine difficulty, genuine embarrassment, genuine financial stress, genuine relational strain, and genuine periods of profound disorientation that the initiated practitioner has processed to varying degrees of completeness, and that the community's culture must create the conditions for processing further rather than merely extracting the operational content of the knowledge and leaving the experiential weight of its acquisition unaddressed. The failure to understand this dual nature of the initiated practitioner's arrival condition, the knowledge as resource and the knowledge as burden simultaneously, is the most common error that communities make in their reception of initiated practitioners, and it is an error that produces a specific and damaging consequence. The initiated practitioner who arrives in the community and is immediately engaged as a knowledge resource, as a mentor, a workshop facilitator, a panel speaker, a validator of other people's plans, before the community has created the conditions for the initiated practitioner's own continued development and the initiated practitioner's own continued need for the specific kind of honest, non-extractive community engagement that the uninitiated arrival needs and that the initiated practitioner needs equally, in a different form and for different reasons. The initiated practitioner is not a completed product of the transition process who has arrived at the transition district to dispense the knowledge their completion has produced. They are a person in an ongoing and evolving relationship with the project of sovereign life who has arrived in the community with a specific set of current needs, current challenges, and current developmental edges that the community must serve as genuinely as it serves the uninitiated arrival's more dramatic and more visible needs, and whose continued productive engagement with the community depends on the community's capacity to provide genuine value to them rather than merely extracting the genuine value they can provide to others. The initiated practitioner's arrival condition is therefore best understood not as a condition of completion but as a condition of transition of a different kind. A transition not from institutional dependency to sovereign practice, which is the uninitiated arrival's transition, but from the specific form of sovereign practice that the initiated practitioner has developed in the conditions of their prior geography and prior community context to the expanded, deepened, and further developed form of sovereign practice that the transition district's specific combination of community density, cultural production infrastructure, and governing mythology makes possible. The initiated practitioner arrives not to teach what they know but to teach what they know while simultaneously learning what the transition district's specific conditions make available for them to learn. The specific dimensions of sovereign practice that require the density of a community of genuine peers, the specific aspects of cultural production that require the infrastructure of a serious publishing and myth-making ecosystem, the specific forms of territorial identity that require the sustained commitment to a specific place that the nomadic phase of many initiated practitioners' trajectories has not provided. This understanding of the initiated practitioner's arrival condition as a transition of a different kind, not a graduation but an expansion, not a completion but a deepening, has direct implications for the design of the initiated practitioner's integration into the community's life. The integration must create the conditions for both dimensions of the initiated practitioner's experience simultaneously. The conditions under which their accumulated knowledge is made genuinely available to the community in the forms that are most useful, and the conditions under which their own continued development is genuinely served by the community's specific capabilities and resources. Designing for one dimension without the other produces the extractive dynamic, in which the initiated practitioner is received as a resource and becomes increasingly resentful of the asymmetry between what they contribute and what they receive, or the indulgent dynamic, in which the initiated practitioner is received as someone whose own development needs are the community's primary concern and who therefore never fully engages their knowledge in the service of the community's other members. Both dynamics waste the initiated practitioner's potential contribution and undermine the community's long-term health. The architecture of arrival for the initiated must therefore be designed to avoid both by creating the specific conditions under which contribution and development are not in tension but are expressions of the same activity. Conditions under which the initiated practitioner's engagement in the community's knowledge transfer activities is itself a form of their own development rather than a cost they incur in the service of others' development. The first phase of the initiated practitioner's arrival is what this chapter calls decompression, and its necessity is less obvious than the necessity of the uninitiated arrival's decompression because the initiated practitioner's arrival condition is less visibly distressed. The uninitiated arrival's disorientation is legible. It presents in the behavioral patterns this handbook has described in preceding chapters: the hesitation, the paralysis, the difficulty structuring time, the social uncertainty, the specific combination of high capability and lost context that makes the disorientation visible to anyone familiar with the condition. The initiated practitioner's arrival condition is less legible because it presents not in disorientation but in a specific kind of operational fatigue that can be mistaken, from the outside, for the settled competence of someone who has figured it out. The initiated practitioner who has been living the post-institutional transition for long enough to have developed a working sovereign practice is, in many cases, a person who has been operating for an extended period in conditions of insufficient community support, insufficient peer engagement at an appropriate level of sophistication, insufficient cultural infrastructure for the specific forms of production they are attempting, and insufficient territorial commitment to develop the depth of place-based identity that sovereign practice ultimately requires as its social foundation. The fatigue produced by sustained sovereign practice in these conditions is real, and it is the kind of fatigue that the community's arrival architecture must address before the initiated practitioner can be genuinely productive within the community rather than merely performing a productivity that is not fully resourced by the actual condition they are in. The decompression phase for the initiated practitioner is therefore not the same as the decompression phase for the uninitiated arrival, though both are necessary and both are neglected by community designs that focus on the dramatic disorientation of the uninitiated while assuming that the initiated practitioner's less dramatic arrival condition requires no specific accommodation. The uninitiated arrival's decompression is the provision of atmospheric safety, the sense that the between state is an acceptable condition, that the disorientation is a productive phase rather than a failure, that the community will not penalize the honest expression of confusion and uncertainty. The initiated practitioner's decompression is the provision of genuine peer encounter, the specific experience of being in a community of people who have done comparable things, who can speak the operational vocabulary of sovereign practice without requiring it to be translated into the vocabulary of institutional life, who are working at a comparable level of sophistication on comparable problems, and who therefore offer the initiated practitioner the specific relief of not having to explain the fundamentals before the interesting conversation can begin. This relief is more significant than it sounds for a person who has spent years being the most experienced person in their immediate community on the specific subjects their sovereign practice addresses. The person who is always the initiator of conversations that others find fascinating but cannot fully participate in, always the explainer of contexts that others find intriguing but do not share, always the most advanced practitioner in a room of people who are at earlier stages of the same process. The experience of being in a room of peers, of being one advanced practitioner among many, where the conversation can begin at the level of genuine operational complexity rather than at the level of introductory orientation, is a specific form of social nourishment that the transition district's density of initiated practitioners makes available in a way that the prior geographic and community contexts of many initiated practitioners have not provided. The decompression phase for the initiated practitioner therefore consists primarily in the provision of high-quality peer engagement. The Monday AI briefings where the conversation about the implications of the week's developments can proceed at the level of operational specificity that initiated practitioners can sustain, The Tuesday Sovereign Publishing Sessions, where the peer feedback on actual production work is provided by people who have enough production experience to give feedback that is genuinely useful rather than generically supportive. The Thursday Transition Dinners, where the initiated practitioner's table position is not the experienced veteran graciously answering the uninitiated arrival's questions, but the peer among peers for whom the conversation about the specific operational challenges of sovereign practice at a sophisticated level is the primary value of the evening rather than a charitable contribution to the evening's educational function. The decompression phase is the phase in which the initiated practitioner is received as a whole person with their own current needs and their own current developmental edges rather than as a knowledge resource whose primary function is the service of other people's needs. The duration of this phase varies with the individual, with the depth of the operational fatigue they are carrying, with the quality of the peer engagement their prior communities provided, with the specific dimensions of their sovereign practice that the community's infrastructure most directly serves, but its necessity is general. No initiated practitioner can be genuinely productive in the community's knowledge transfer functions without first having received the specific nourishment of genuine peer encounter that the decompression phase is designed to provide. The second phase is redeployment, the specific process through which the initiated practitioner's accumulated knowledge, refreshed by the decompression phase's genuine peer engagement and newly oriented by the community's specific governing vocabulary and cultural infrastructure, is organized into the forms of contribution that are most useful to the community and most fully expressive of the initiated practitioner's specific capabilities and most genuinely developmental for the initiated practitioner's own continued growth. The redeployment phase is not the assignment of the initiated practitioner to a predetermined role in the community's knowledge transfer hierarchy. It is the collaborative process through which the initiated practitioner and the community together identify the specific forms of contribution that the intersection of the initiated practitioner's specific capabilities and the community's specific current needs makes most productive. The forms of contribution available to the initiated practitioner in the community's ecosystem are diverse enough to accommodate the genuine diversity of the initiated practitioner's specific capabilities and the genuine diversity of their specific developmental interests. And the architecture of arrival for the initiated must reflect this diversity rather than channeling all initiated practitioners toward the same generic mentorship role that the knowledge transfer function of the community is too often reduced to. The initiated practitioner who has developed a specific expertise in AI-assisted publishing workflows has a different optimal contribution mode from the initiated practitioner who has developed a specific expertise in the economics of creative freelance practice, who has a different optimal contribution mode from the initiated practitioner who has developed a specific expertise in the community formation challenges of post-institutional professional networks, who has a different optimal contribution mode from the initiated practitioner who has developed a specific expertise in the specific failure modes of the creative practice transition and the specific early warning signals that allow those failure modes to be identified and addressed before they become irreversible. Each of these specific expertises is a genuine community resource, and the redeployment phase is the process through which each specific expertise finds its most productive expression in the community's specific current needs. The redeployment of the initiated practitioner's knowledge into the community's ecosystem occurs through several specific channels, each of which serves a different function in the community's knowledge transfer architecture. The first and most direct channel is the transition dinner, the Thursday evening gathering that this handbook has described in structural terms in its mapping of the weekly metabolism, and that is the primary vehicle for the specific form of knowledge transfer that the initiated practitioner's hardest-won operational knowledge is most suited to. The transition dinner is designed for the kind of knowledge that is most resistant to formalization, the knowledge of the failure modes, the knowledge of the unexpected costs, the knowledge of the specific moments of breakdown that the formal analysis of the transition process never quite captures because the formal analysis is always based on the cases that succeeded rather than the cases that failed at specific identifiable points for specific identifiable reasons. The initiated practitioner at the transition dinner table is not a panel speaker presenting a curated account of their transition journey. They are a peer in an honest conversation whose value is proportional to the honesty of the account they are able to give. The account that includes the specific month when the financial projection proved wrong and the specific form in which it proved wrong and the specific response that either corrected the error or failed to correct it and the specific consequences of the failure. The account that includes the specific relationship that was most damaged by the transition and the specific way in which the damage was produced and the specific degree to which the damage was or was not subsequently repaired. the account that includes the specific moment of deepest disillusionment and the specific thing that made continuing the transition seem worth attempting despite the disillusionment, and the specific way in which what made it seem worth continuing turned out to be accurate or inaccurate in the event. This level of operational honesty is not comfortable to provide and is not comfortable to receive, and the transition dinner's social architecture, the small table, the shared meal, the structured question format that establishes honest operational engagement as the evening's explicit norm, is designed specifically to create the conditions under which this level of honesty is both expected and protected. Expected because the evening's governing question, how did you actually redesign your life, with all the specificity and all the mess that the actual redesign produced, establishes honest operational account as the form of contribution the evening requires. Protected because the small table and the shared meal and the explicit norm of confidentiality within the community's culture create the social safety that honest operational account requires in order to be given rather than replaced with the curated version of the account that social self-protection otherwise produces. The second channel of redeployment is the Friday reality stress test, the weekly session in which participants present proposed life designs, business models, sovereign practice architectures, and post-institutional transition strategies for collective operational assessment. The initiated practitioner's contribution to the reality stress test is qualitatively different from the uninitiated arrival's contribution, though both are genuinely valuable, and the distinction between them should not be formalized into a hierarchy of evaluative authority that the initiated practitioner holds and the uninitiated arrival does not. The initiated practitioner brings to the stress test the specific operational knowledge of the failure modes, the capacity to identify, in the presented proposal, the specific points of vulnerability that the presenter may not have recognized because they have not previously encountered those specific failure modes in the specific form that the proposal is about to encounter them. The uninitiated arrival brings to the stress test the fresh perspective of someone who does not share the initiated practitioner's prior experience of the failure modes and who may therefore identify different vulnerabilities, or the same vulnerabilities from a different angle, or the unexpected strengths that the initiated practitioner's familiarity with the failure modes has caused them to underweight. The richest stress test sessions are the ones in which both kinds of contribution are present, in which the initiated practitioner's operational depth and the uninitiated arrival's fresh perspective are brought to bear on the same proposal simultaneously, producing an assessment that is both operationally grounded and imaginatively open in a way that neither kind of contribution alone could produce. The third channel is the sovereign publishing infrastructure, the Tuesday production sessions, and the broader ecosystem of publications, NFPs, newsletters, and multilingual outputs that the community's publishing practice generates. The initiated practitioner's redeployment into the publishing ecosystem is not primarily the contribution of their operational knowledge in written form, though the documentation of operational knowledge in publishable form is one of the most important functions of the publishing ecosystem and one of the most directly useful services the initiated practitioner can provide to the broader community of transitioning professionals beyond the district's geographic boundaries. The primary redeployment of the initiated practitioner into the publishing ecosystem is the contribution of the specific publishing expertise that their prior sovereign practice has developed, the expertise of someone who has already built the reader relationships, already developed the editorial voice, already navigated the monetization challenges, already experienced the specific failure modes of the newsletter-dependent revenue model or the book-dependent credentialing strategy or the speaking fee-dependent income architecture, and who can therefore offer to the community's newer publishers the specific operational guidance that would have made their own publishing development less costly and more effective if it had been available to them at the beginning of their own publishing practice. The fourth channel, and in many ways the most important for the community's long-term cultural health, is the myth-making apparatus, the Wednesday Parallel Civilization Night, and the broader ecosystem of speculative narrative production, world-building, and cultural creation that gives the community its governing mythology and its civilizational imagination. The initiated practitioner's contribution to the myth-making apparatus is not merely the content of their accumulated operational experience, though the operational experience of having built a sovereign practice, with all its specific discoveries about what a life outside institutional scaffolding actually looks, feels, and functions like, is precisely the kind of lived reality content that gives speculative fiction its texture and its credibility. The primary contribution of the initiated practitioner to the myth-making apparatus is the specific quality of narrative authority that genuine experience confers, the capacity to write about the post-institutional future with the specific detail and the specific honesty that only someone who has actually tried to live there can bring, rather than the abstract projections of someone who has theorized about the post-institutional future from the position of institutional security that makes the theorizing intellectually interesting but operationally thin. The initiated practitioner's speculative narrative is not escapism. It is reporting from a territory that most of the reading audience has not yet entered, written by someone who has spent enough time there to know what the mornings actually feel like, what the specific texture of the Tuesday publishing session looks like from the inside rather than the outside, what the specific quality of the Thursday transition dinner conversation produces in a person who has been having comparable conversations for 3 years and has watched the specific arc of other people's transitions from the position of someone who has already traversed a version of that arc themselves. The fifth channel is the governance structure, the community's decision-making processes and cultural standards, in which the initiated practitioner's accumulated operational judgment is the primary resource for the community's ongoing calibration of its own culture. The initiated practitioner's participation in governance is not the assignment of formal authority. The community's governance structure should be designed to resist the concentration of formal authority in ways that produce the gatekeeping culture that the preceding chapter identified as one of the 2 fatal design errors, but the contribution of the cultural authority that genuine experience produces in a community that has been designed to recognize and respond to that authority through the natural deference of genuinely respect-based rather than formally mandated influence. The initiated practitioner who has been in the community for sufficient time to have accumulated genuine knowledge of the community's culture and its specific strengths and weaknesses and its specific current developmental challenges is the person best positioned to hold the community's standards, to maintain the commitment to operational honesty that distinguishes the community's culture from the retreat industry's affirmational culture, to resist the drift toward the comfortable over the honest that is the community's most persistent internal temptation, to maintain the specific quality of genuine engagement rather than performed engagement that the community's dream validation function requires as its primary operating condition. The initiated practitioner's governance contribution is exercised most powerfully not through formal decision-making processes but through the specific quality of their daily embodied practice, through the visible demonstration, in the community's daily life, of the specific standards and the specific values that the community's governing vocabulary describes. The initiated practitioner who maintains rigorous intellectual honesty in their public contributions to the Monday briefings and the Tuesday publishing sessions and the Wednesday myth-making nights and the Thursday dinners and the Friday stress tests is maintaining the community's cultural standard for intellectual honesty more effectively than any governance rule or protocol could maintain it, because they are demonstrating through practice what the standard looks like when it is genuinely held rather than merely endorsed in principle. The initiated practitioner, who treats the uninitiated arrival's genuine disorientation with the specific combination of honest engagement and patient respect, without either the condescension of the expert addressing the novice or the false equivalence of the experienced person pretending that their experience gives them no special purchase on the specific operational questions the uninitiated arrival is navigating, is demonstrating through practice what the community's culture of uninitiated relationship looks like at its best, and establishing through demonstration the norm that subsequent initiated practitioners and uninitiated arrivals will relate to each other by. The redeployment of the initiated practitioner's knowledge through these 5 channels is not a program that the community administers to the initiated practitioner. It is a culture that the community creates, a set of ambient conditions, temporal rhythms, social expectations, and spatial arrangements that make the initiated practitioner's genuine contribution the natural default of their daily participation in the community's life rather than the deliberate performance of a role that the community has assigned them. The difference between the two is the difference between a community that extracts value from its initiated practitioners and a community that creates the conditions under which the initiated practitioner's genuine engagement in the community's life naturally produces value. Value for the community and value for the initiated practitioner simultaneously, in the recursive dynamic of contribution and development that the architecture of arrival is designed to make the community's fundamental operating condition. The initiated practitioner who has successfully passed through the decompression phase and entered the redeployment phase of the arrival architecture is, in the transition district's ecosystem, the closest thing to a complete self-sustaining participant. The person whose presence generates value for every other participant in the community while simultaneously receiving from the community the specific forms of value that their own continued development requires. They are, in the vocabulary of this handbook, continuity multipliers. People whose presence in the community multiplies the community's capacity for its primary function, the support of genuine post-institutional transition, by providing the knowledge, the proof of concept, the cultural authority, and the embodied standard of sovereign practice that makes the community's ecosystem function rather than merely aspire to function. Their presence is the condition of the community's credibility. Their continued presence is the condition of the community's durability. Their conversion of arriving uninitiated practitioners into future initiated practitioners is the condition of the community's self-renewal. And their own continued development, the ongoing expansion and deepening of their sovereign practice that the community's specific infrastructure makes possible, is the condition of their continued engagement with a community that must serve their genuine needs as genuinely as it serves the more dramatic and more visible needs of the uninitiated arrivals, whose disorientation makes their needs more legible and whose transformation makes the community's purpose more visibly evident. The architecture of arrival for the initiated is therefore not a welcome ceremony and not a role assignment and not a mentorship program. It is the design of the specific conditions, decompression first, redeployment second, ongoing peer engagement and genuine developmental support throughout, under which the initiated practitioner's accumulated operational knowledge is converted from a private asset, carried at personal cost through the specific difficulties of the transition, into a community resource that generates value for every arriving person who needs it while simultaneously deepening and expanding through its use, rather than depleting through it. The knowledge that is shared genuinely in a community designed to receive it does not diminish. It grows. The initiated practitioner who gives honest account of the failure modes at the Thursday dinner is not impoverished by the giving. They are enriched by it, enriched by the specific quality of the community's reception of the honest account, enriched by the questions the reception generates that deepen their own understanding of the failure they are accounting for, enriched by the relationship that the honest account produces with the person receiving it, which is a relationship of equality that the performed account, the curated version, the inspiring narrative of transition successfully completed, never produces because it does not offer the vulnerability that genuine mutual knowledge requires. Decompression and redeployment. The sequence matters. The decompression is what makes the redeployment genuine rather than extractive. The redeployment is what makes the decompression productive rather than indulgent. Together they constitute the architecture of arrival for the person who brings to the community the most valuable thing any community can have. The honest, operational, experientially grounded, failure-tested knowledge of what it actually costs and what it actually produces to build a sovereign life outside the institutional framework that the professional world is now, at the civilizational scale, in the process of dissolving. The initiated practitioner knows this. The community needs what the initiated practitioner knows. The architecture of arrival is how the knowing and the needing find each other in the specific forms that make both genuinely productive rather than merely transactional. The transaction is the failure mode. The genuine encounter is the architecture's aim. Part 3. The Architecture of ARRIVAL Chapter 14. The Uninitiated. Staged Cognitive Acclimatization. The uninitiated arrival's first day in Aldea Zama is an event of considerable psychological complexity that the community's architecture of arrival must be designed to handle with a specific combination of warmth and honesty that is more difficult to sustain than either quality alone. The warmth is necessary because the arriving person is in a genuine state of vulnerability, not the performed vulnerability of the retreat industry's opening circle, in which participants are invited to share their feelings in a context designed to produce emotional disclosure as a group cohesion mechanism, but the real vulnerability of a person who has made a significant decision about their own life under conditions of genuine uncertainty and who is now standing in the physical consequence of that decision with insufficient information about whether the decision was wise, whether the community they have arrived in is what they understood it to be, whether the transition they have committed to is genuinely possible in the form they have imagined it, and whether they have what it takes to complete it. The honesty is necessary because the specific form of warmth that the retreat industry provides, the unconditional affirmation of the arriving person's decision to be there, the enthusiastic endorsement of their aspiration to live differently, the social atmosphere that communicates that the community has been waiting for exactly this person and that their arrival is a wonderful event that the community is thrilled to witness, is a form of warmth that produces, in the sophisticated arriving professional, either immediate skepticism or temporary comfort followed by delayed disillusionment when the reality of the community's actual demands becomes apparent. and neither response is productive for the genuine transition process the community is designed to support. The specific combination of warmth and honesty that the uninitiated arrival's first encounters with the community must embody is the combination that communicates, simultaneously and without contradiction, two things that might seem in tension but are not. That the community is genuinely glad the person has arrived and genuinely committed to supporting their transition, and that the community's support is the specific kind of support that genuine transition requires, honest, demanding, operationally grounded, rather than the specific kind of support that the retreat industry provides and that the arriving person may have been conditioned by prior retreat experiences to expect. This communication must occur primarily through the ambient quality of the community's culture rather than through explicit statements about what the community is and is not, because explicit statements about the community's culture tend to produce the same effect that any explicit statement of values produces in a sophisticated listener. The immediate application of critical intelligence to the question of whether the stated values correspond to the actual practice, a question that cannot be answered by the statement alone and that therefore produces suspension of judgment rather than the genuine orientation that the statement was intended to produce. The community's culture must be encountered rather than stated, which means the architecture of arrival for the uninitiated must be designed to make the genuine culture of the community immediately and viscerally present in the arriving person's first encounters with the community rather than waiting for the arriving person to discover it through sufficient duration of participation. The challenge of designing the uninitiated arrival's experience of the community's culture is complicated by the heterogeneity of the uninitiated arriving population, the genuine diversity of the psychological states, the prior experiences, the specific capabilities and specific deficits, the specific needs and specific fears that different uninitiated arrivals bring to their first encounters with the community. The preceding chapter's mapping of the arriving population's primary cohorts has established the broad outlines of this diversity, but the diversity within each cohort is as significant as the diversity between cohorts, and the architecture of arrival must be designed to accommodate individual variation within the framework it provides for the cohort-level differences. The laid-off AI engineer and the disillusioned digital nomad and the burned-out executive and the platform-exhausted creative practitioner are each uninitiated in a different way, and the community's architecture of arrival must be sophisticated enough to recognize and respond to the specific form of their uninitiatedness rather than treating all uninitiated arrivals as instances of a single generic condition that a single generic integration process can adequately address. The concept this chapter proposes for organizing the uninitiated arrival's integration into the community's life is staged cognitive acclimatization, a formulation that deserves careful unpacking because each of its three components carries specific meaning that shapes the architecture it describes. Staged means organized in a deliberate sequence of phases, each of which prepares the arriving person for the next by providing the specific experiences, relationships, and cognitive frameworks that make the subsequent phases' demands accessible rather than overwhelming. Cognitive means addressed to the arriving person's thinking, to the specific mental models, professional habits, institutional reflexes, and identity structures that were formed in the predisplacement context and that shape, often invisibly and often resistantly, the arriving person's capacity to engage with the community's culture and the community's challenge. Acclimatization means the gradual, physiologically paced process of adapting to a different environment, a process whose biological analogy is deliberately chosen, because the pace of genuine cognitive adaptation is governed by the same kind of physiological constraints that govern the pace of physical acclimatization, and the failure to respect those constraints produces the same kind of pathological response in cognitive adaptation that altitude sickness produces in physical acclimatization. The potentially severe negative consequence of exceeding the organism's current adaptive capacity. The staged cognitive acclimatization framework is organized into 4 phases, each with specific purposes, specific experiences, and specific transition conditions, the specific markers that indicate the arriving person's readiness to move into the subsequent phase rather than remaining in the current one. The phases are not strictly sequential in the sense that each must be fully completed before the next can begin. The transitions between phases are gradual rather than sharp, and elements of later phases will be present in preliminary form during earlier phases for arriving persons who are ready for them. But the general sequence is determined by the logic of cognitive adaptation rather than by the community's administrative convenience, and departures from it produce the characteristic failure modes of integration processes that mistake the pace of the ambitious for the pace of the genuine. The first phase is called atmospheric reception. It is the phase that begins at the moment of the uninitiated arrival's first encounter with the community's physical and social environment, and that continues, at varying lengths depending on the individual's prior experience and psychological readiness, until the arriving person has achieved the specific quality of psychological safety that is the prerequisite for the subsequent phase's more demanding engagements. The purpose of the atmospheric reception phase is precisely what its name suggests: the reception of the arriving person into the atmosphere of the community, not into its program, not into its governance, not into its demands, not into its governing vocabulary, but into the specific felt sense of the community's physical environment and human presence that constitutes its atmosphere, and that is the most immediate and most powerful communicator of what the community is before any explicit statement of what it is can be formulated or received. The atmospheric reception phase is the phase in which the community's most important work is the work of the physical environment itself, the work of the liminal district's specific atmospheric qualities described in Part 2 of this handbook. The semi-occupied plazas, the eerie quality of the between-time, the specific texture of the jungle pressing against the stone, the pedestrian corridors that produce accidental encounter, the quality of light and material and scale that the first phase's design intelligence made available. All of these are doing the most important work of the atmospheric reception phase, which is the work of communicating to the arriving person that they are in a genuinely different environment, that the cognitive frameworks and social reflexes that serve them in the institutional context are not the appropriate instruments for navigating this environment, and that the disorientation they are experiencing is not a personal inadequacy but a natural and necessary response to the encounter with genuine difference. The physical environment communicates this in the way that only physical environments can communicate it, through the immediate, non-conceptual, visceral experience of being somewhere that is organized differently from any previously inhabited environment. And the community's architecture of arrival must trust the physical environment to do this work rather than supplementing it with explicit verbal communication that would intellectualize the experience before the experience has had the opportunity to do its own work. The human elements of the atmospheric reception phase are equally important but equally restrained. The arriving person's first encounters with the community's members should be characterized by the quality that the community's culture most fundamentally embodies, and that the architectural reception phase is designed to establish as the community's ambient norm. Genuine interest without extraction, genuine warmth without performance, genuine openness without the social pressure of the affirmational culture that turns every new arrival into an occasion for the community to demonstrate its capacity for enthusiastic welcome. The community member who encounters the uninitiated arrival in the atmospheric reception phase is not performing the community's values for the arriving person's benefit. They are living those values in the specific form that the atmospheric reception phase requires, the form of patient, curious, non-extractive presence that gives the arriving person the experience of being genuinely seen without being immediately categorized, genuinely welcomed without being immediately enrolled, genuinely engaged without being immediately assessed. This quality of presence is not natural to people who have been trained by institutional cultures in which every new encounter is an opportunity for rapid mutual assessment and strategic relationship positioning, and its cultivation in the community's members is one of the most important functions of the initiated practitioner's embodied demonstration of the community's values. The initiated practitioner who has been in the community long enough to have genuinely internalized the community's culture of non-extractive encounter is the primary model for the quality of presence that the atmospheric reception phase requires, and their visible daily practice of this quality is the most effective instruction available for the community's newer members in how to receive an uninitiated arrival in the way that the atmospheric reception phase demands. The specific activities and engagements appropriate to the atmospheric reception phase are the community's public and accessible programming elements, the events and gatherings that require no prior investment in the community's program and no prior familiarity with its governing vocabulary to derive genuine value from. The Saturday Atmosphere Night is the paradigmatic atmospheric reception activity, a gathering that is experientially rich and culturally orienting without demanding any specific prior knowledge or prior commitment from the participant, that communicates the community's myth-making ambition and its aesthetic sensibility and its commitment to cultural production through direct experience rather than through explicit description. The Sunday Integration Day's quiet sessions and communal outdoor activities are equally accessible and equally appropriate to the atmospheric reception phase, providing the arriving person with the experience of the community's relationship to the natural environment and the community's culture of protected time and reflective space without requiring the kind of active participation and honest self-disclosure that the later phases will demand. The informal gathering around the district's common areas, the accidental conversations in the pedestrian corridors, the unscheduled meetings in the shared workspaces, the shared meals in the restaurants that are among the district's active commercial establishments, are the most important atmospheric reception activities precisely because they are unscheduled, because they occur through the natural operation of the community's daily life rather than through any programmatic design, and because they provide the arriving person with evidence of the community's culture in its most unguarded and therefore most authentic form. The transition condition for moving from the atmospheric reception phase to the second phase, the condition that indicates the arriving person's readiness for the more demanding engagements of the subsequent phase, is not a defined duration of time or a formal assessment of the arriving person's progress. It is the specific quality of psychological safety that the atmospheric reception phase is designed to produce. The arriving person's genuine comfort with the ambiguity of the between state, their genuine ease in the community's physical and social environment, and their genuine curiosity about the community's program and culture, a curiosity that is not the anxious curiosity of someone who needs to understand the rules in order to avoid violating them, but the genuinely engaged curiosity of someone who has been sufficiently received by the atmosphere to want to understand what is happening below the atmosphere's surface. The second phase is called contextual orientation. It begins when the arriving person has achieved the psychological safety of the atmospheric reception phase and is ready to engage with the community's program and culture at a level that requires the beginning of conscious, deliberate engagement with the governing vocabulary and the operational practices that define the community's identity. The contextual orientation phase is the phase in which the community's governing framework is introduced, not through a formal induction curriculum or a structured onboarding program, but through the natural engagement with the community's programmatic activities at the level of conscious participation rather than the ambient absorption of the atmospheric reception phase. The Monday AI briefings become a regular engagement. The Wednesday parallel civilization nights become not merely aesthetically stimulating experiences but occasions for beginning to understand the community's specific relationship between speculative narrative and operational reality. The Thursday transition dinners become the first occasions for genuine personal disclosure. Not the deep operational disclosure of the Friday reality stress tests, but the initial, exploratory disclosure of someone who is beginning to understand that the community's culture of honest engagement is genuine rather than performed and who is beginning to test the safety of that culture by offering progressively more honest accounts of their own situation. The contextual orientation phase is also the phase in which the arriving person begins to encounter the community's governing vocabulary in a form sufficiently contextualized by the atmospheric reception phase's preparation to be genuinely receivable rather than merely intellectually accessible. The difference between receiving a conceptual framework and intellectually assessing it is the difference between allowing the framework to change the way you think and evaluating the framework from within the cognitive structures it is designed to change. The atmospheric reception phase's disruption of the arriving person's existing cognitive frameworks, the defamiliarization produced by the encounter with the community's genuinely different physical and social environment, creates the specific cognitive openness that makes genuine reception of the governing vocabulary possible, rather than the defensive intellectual assessment that the framework would receive from a person whose existing cognitive frameworks had not been sufficiently disrupted to create the openness that genuine reception requires. The governing vocabulary must therefore be introduced in the contextual orientation phase rather than in the atmospheric reception phase, because the atmospheric reception phase's work of creating cognitive openness must precede the governing vocabulary's introduction for the introduction to produce genuine reception rather than intellectual evaluation. The specific activities that serve the contextual orientation phase's purposes are the community's programming elements that require modest prior investment and that introduce the governing vocabulary through practice rather than through instruction. The Tuesday Sovereign Publishing Session in its introductory form, the version of the session that is designed for participants who have no existing publishing practice and no existing audience but who are beginning to understand that the production of publishable content is the primary instrument of intellectual sovereignty, introduces the governing vocabulary of sovereign publishing through the immediate experience of attempting to produce something publishable, which is a more effective introduction to the vocabulary than any description of the vocabulary could provide, because it makes the vocabulary's specific operational content immediately relevant to the specific challenge the participant is currently engaged with. The Monday AI Briefings discussion component, the roundtable conversation that follows the week's development summary, and in which participants are invited to connect the developments to their own specific professional situations, introduces the governing vocabulary of post-institutional cognitive synchronization through the experience of attempting to perform the synchronization in real time, with the community's more experienced members modeling the specific quality of engaged, non-anxious, operationally focused attention to the accelerating landscape that the vocabulary describes. The transition condition for the contextual orientation phase is the arriving person's development of what might be called productive discomfort, the specific quality of engagement with the community's program and culture in which the arriving person is genuinely challenged by the community's demands but not overwhelmed by them, in which the gap between the community's expectations and the arriving person's current capacity is motivating rather than paralyzing, and in which the arriving person has sufficient trust in the community's culture and sufficient familiarity with its governing vocabulary to begin engaging with the more demanding activities of the subsequent phase without the defensive reactions that the earlier phase's more accessible programming was designed to prevent. The third phase is called operational engagement. It is the phase in which the arriving person moves from absorbing the community's culture to participating in its production, from being a recipient of the community's programmatic offerings to being a contributor to them, from consuming the transition district's atmosphere and programming to generating content for and within them. The operational engagement phase is the phase in which the uninitiated arrival begins to cross the threshold from consumer to contributor that this handbook identifies as the central developmental transition of the transition district experience. And it is the phase that is most directly supported by the community's specific programmatic infrastructure and most directly dependent on the quality of the relationships developed in the preceding phases for its successful navigation. The primary vehicle for the operational engagement phase is the Friday Reality Stress Test, the weekly session that is the most demanding of the community's programmatic offerings and the one that most directly confronts the arriving person with the specific gap between their proposed life design and the operational reality that the design will encounter. The reality stress test requires the arriving person to present something genuine, a real proposal, a real plan, a real aspiration for the form of their post-institutional practice, to a community of people who are committed to honest assessment rather than generous affirmation, and to receive the honest assessment with the specific combination of openness and resilience that productive engagement with criticism requires. This is not a comfortable demand. The arriving person who brings their proposed life design to the Friday Reality Stress Test is bringing something that is deeply personally significant, that is, in the most immediate sense, their current best theory of how their life should be organized, to a community whose explicit culture is the honest assessment of whether the theory is adequate to the operational reality it will encounter. The experience of having a deeply personally significant theory subjected to honest communal assessment is not comfortable for anyone, and the specific form of discomfort it produces is the specific form that the transition process most requires, the discomfort of discovering, in a context of sufficient community trust and sufficient psychological safety to make the discovery productive rather than devastating, the specific dimensions of the proposed life design that are inadequate to the operational reality they will encounter, so that the inadequacies can be addressed in the design rather than discovered in the execution, at a point where addressing them costs significantly less than addressing them would cost after the execution has already begun. The operational engagement phase is also the phase in which the arriving person's contribution to the community's cultural production ecosystem begins to take form. The Tuesday Sovereign Publishing session moves from the introductory version, the production of the first piece, the establishment of the first publication infrastructure, the beginning of the relationship between the arriving person and the community's publishing culture, to the engaged version, in which the arriving person is producing regularly and receiving and giving feedback on others' production with sufficient familiarity with the community's publishing standards to make the feedback genuinely useful rather than merely supportive. The Wednesday Parallel Civilization Night moves from attendance and observation to participation and contribution, from watching the speculative narratives unfold to offering contributions to the community's shared mythological project, from appreciating the world-building exercise to beginning to understand what the world-building exercise is for and why the specific form of cultural production it represents is central to the community's long-term identity rather than peripheral to it. The transition condition for the operational engagement phase is perhaps the most difficult to specify precisely because it is the most qualitative and the most individual of the four phases transition conditions. It is the moment at which the arriving person's engagement with the community's program shifts from the motivated engagement of someone who is receiving value from the community's offerings to the committed engagement of someone who is genuinely invested in the community's collective project. Invested not merely in the community's capacity to support their own individual transition, but in the community's capacity to fulfill its broader purpose of supporting the transitions of all its members, and of demonstrating, to the world beyond its geographic boundaries, that the post-institutional transition is both possible and worth making. This shift is the transition from participant to stakeholder, the moment at which the community's success becomes personally significant to the arriving person, not only because the community's success supports their own individual transition, but because the community's broader purpose has become genuinely important to them as a purpose worth serving beyond the personal interest they have in its success. The fourth phase is called sovereign contribution. It is not strictly a phase of the arrival process in the way that the preceding three phases are, because it does not have a defined endpoint and does not represent a stage of the arriving person's integration into the community's existing culture. It represents, instead, the arriving person's full integration into the community as a contributing member, a person whose presence in the community is characterized not by the consumption of the community's offerings or the learning of the community's culture, but by the genuine, distinctive, irreplaceable contribution of the specific capabilities, perspectives, and operational knowledge that the arriving person has developed through the specific trajectory of their own transition. The sovereign contribution phase is the phase in which the arriving person stops being an arriving person and becomes a community member, a member whose specific contribution to the community's life and cultural production and knowledge base and mythological development is something the community genuinely needs and genuinely benefits from, rather than something the community generously accommodates in the service of the member's individual development. The sovereign contribution phase is the destination of the staged cognitive acclimatization framework, but it is important to be clear that the destination is not a fixed point or a completed state. The sovereign contributor is not a person who has finished their own transition and is now purely in service of others' transitions. They are a person whose transition has reached the stage at which their own continued development and their contribution to the community's collective project are sufficiently aligned that the distinction between the two is no longer the organizing principle of their relationship to the community. They are, in the vocabulary this handbook uses elsewhere, in the process of becoming initiated, of crossing the threshold between the uninitiated and the initiated, not as a formal ceremony of completion but as a gradual accumulation of the specific operational knowledge, the specific community relationships, the specific embodied practice of sovereign life, and the specific depth of territorial commitment that the initiated practitioner's standing in the community requires, and that the staged cognitive acclimatization framework, at its best, produces. The crossing of this threshold, the transformation of the uninitiated arrival into the initiated practitioner, is the community's most important long-term product, more important even than the individual transitions it supports, because it is the mechanism of the community's self-renewal. Each uninitiated arrival who successfully traverses the four phases of the staged cognitive acclimatization framework and arrives at the sovereign contribution phase is a future initiated practitioner whose accumulated operational knowledge, tested in the specific conditions of the transition district's community and validated against the specific operational realities of post-institutional practice in this specific geography at this specific historical moment, is the primary resource for the next generation of uninitiated arrivals. The recursive structure is the community's durability, the mechanism through which the knowledge and the culture and the mythological framework and the operational practices that the founding cohort established in the community's founding period are transmitted, with modification and expansion but also with essential continuity, through each subsequent generation of the community's membership, maintaining the community's essential character while adapting its specific operational content to the specific conditions that each subsequent generation of arriving professionals is navigating. The staged cognitive acclimatization framework is not a program. It cannot be administered to the uninitiated arrival by the community's management. It can only be made available through the design of the community's physical environment, temporal metabolism, social culture, and governance structures, as the natural default of the arriving person's engagement with the community's life. The arriving person who encounters the community through the atmospheric reception phase's entry point programming, who finds the community's culture genuinely safe enough to attempt the contextual orientation phase's more demanding engagement, who develops sufficient trust in the community's honest assessment culture to submit their proposed life design to the operational engagement phase's reality stress test, and who discovers through that process the specific ways in which their proposed design needs modification and the specific capabilities their sovereign practice requires for its realization. This person is undergoing the staged cognitive acclimatization not because the community has administered a program to them, but because the community has designed its culture and its physical environment and its temporal metabolism to make the natural progression through these stages the path of least resistance for a person who is genuinely seeking the specific support that genuine post-institutional transition requires. The path of least resistance is the architecture's ultimate achievement. When the community's design is working at its best, the uninitiated arrival does not experience the staged cognitive acclimatization as a process imposed on them by the community's integration architecture. They experience it as the natural unfolding of their own engagement with a community whose culture is so consistently and so genuinely what it claims to be that the engagement deepens of its own accord, driven by the arriving person's own growing trust in the community's honesty and their own growing investment in the community's collective project, without the need for any explicit management of the integration process beyond the design of the conditions that make the natural deepening the natural outcome. The architecture is invisible when it works. The arriving person's experience is the experience of finding, gradually and through genuine encounter, a community that is genuinely what they needed, not the community they imagined when they first heard the governing vocabulary, which was inevitably colored by their prior experiences and prior frameworks and prior hopes, but the community that their actual transition requires, which is the specific, demanding, honest, operationally grounded, mythologically rich, genuinely welcoming, genuinely challenging community that the staged cognitive acclimatization framework is designed to produce from the raw material of the arriving person's genuine potential and the community's genuine culture. That is the architecture's purpose. The arrival is the beginning. The acclimatization is the process. The sovereign contribution is the destination. The community's renewal is the consequence. And the consequence is the point. Part 3. The Architecture of ARRIVAL Chapter 15. The Dream Validation Framework in full. The name is the first problem. Dream validation sounds like something that happens at a retreat, a weekend workshop in which participants share their deepest aspirations with a group of empathetic strangers who affirm the aspiration's worthiness through a combination of enthusiastic nodding, carefully worded reflective statements, and the collective generation of an atmosphere of mutual possibility that persists for approximately 72 hours after the participants return to their regular lives before dissolving entirely into the ambient pressure of the conditions that the retreat was designed to provide temporary relief from. This is not what dream validation means in the context of this handbook, and the distance between what it sounds like and what it actually is represents one of the most consequential distinctions the transition district's culture must maintain, because the confusion between the two is not merely a semantic inconvenience but a strategic vulnerability, the specific point at which the transition district's governing framework is most susceptible to the colonization of motivational culture that would hollow out the framework's operational content while preserving its surface vocabulary, producing a community that uses the language of dream validation while practicing the culture of dream affirmation, and that therefore delivers to its participants the specific combination of temporary inspiration and durable inadequacy that the retreat industry has been delivering at scale for decades without any apparent recognition that the combination is precisely the inverse of the genuine service it claims to provide. Dream validation, in the full sense that this chapter is developing, is the rigorous, community-embedded, operationally specific, longitudinally sustained process of determining whether a proposed life design, a specific proposed organization of one's time, capability, community, economic architecture, creative practice, geographic commitment, and personal relationships, can survive contact with the operational realities that the proposed design will encounter, and if it cannot survive in its current form, what specific modifications to what specific elements of the design would make survival possible without evacuating the desire that generated the design in the first place. This definition contains several elements that each deserve unpacking, because each element distinguishes the dream validation framework from the adjacent but fundamentally different practices that the similar vocabulary might be confused with. Rigorous means that the process is conducted with the specific intellectual discipline that distinguishes genuine operational assessment from the forms of analysis that produce the appearance of rigor without its substance. The genuine rigor of dream validation is the rigor of the stress test rather than the rigor of the academic paper, the rigor that operates by attempting to break the thing being tested rather than the rigor that operates by building the most sophisticated possible theoretical analysis of the thing being tested. The difference is the difference between finding out whether a bridge will hold through engineering analysis and finding out whether it will hold by driving a truck across it. Both forms of rigor are necessary, and the dream validation framework incorporates both, but the stress test rigor is primary because the ultimate test of a proposed life design is not whether it is theoretically coherent but whether it is practically survivable, and the assessment of practical survivability requires the specific kind of stress that only the attempt to break the thing being tested can provide. Community embedded means that the validation process occurs within and through a specific community of practitioners whose accumulated operational knowledge of the relevant failure modes is the primary instrument of the stress testing. This distinguishes dream validation from the individual forms of self-assessment, the journal practice, the personal coach, the online assessment tool, that the personal development industry offers as substitutes for the community-embedded process. Individual forms of self-assessment are not without value, and they have a specific role within the dream validation framework, but they are insufficient as the primary validation mechanism because the individual self-assessment is necessarily conducted from within the cognitive frameworks that the proposed life design was generated by, which means that the failure modes the individual is least likely to identify are precisely the failure modes that are most shaped by the cognitive frameworks. They are operating within. The community provides the cognitive diversity, the range of different operational frameworks, different prior experiences, different specific knowledge of different failure modes, that allows the stress test to identify the vulnerabilities that any individual's self-assessment framework would leave invisible. Operationally specific means that the validation process is conducted at the level of operational detail rather than the level of strategic aspiration. The validation of a proposed sovereign publishing practice is not the assessment of whether the aspiration to be a sovereign publisher is worthy and meaningful. It is the assessment of whether the specific proposed combination of content focus, publication frequency, audience development strategy, monetization model, platform selection, and time investment is adequate to produce the specific financial and professional outcomes the proposer needs the publishing practice to produce, within the specific time frame they have available before their financial runway requires the practice to be generating sufficient income to sustain the life they are proposing to build around it. This is the level of specificity at which the validation process produces genuinely useful information rather than generally encouraging or generally discouraging signals that the proposer cannot act on because the level of abstraction at which they are delivered makes the specific modifications they imply unidentifiable. Operational specificity is the feature of the dream validation framework that is most consistently absent from the adjacent practices that the similar vocabulary describes, because operational specificity is the feature that is most uncomfortable to insist upon, most likely to produce the specific moment of discomfort in which the beautiful aspiration encounters the granular operational reality that it will have to survive, and most likely to generate the specific form of cognitive and emotional resistance that sophisticated human beings deploy, sometimes with remarkable creativity, against the intrusion of operational reality into their relationship with their own aspirations. Longitudinally sustained means that the validation process occurs not in a single assessment session but across the duration of the proposer's engagement with the transition district's community, across the multiple iterations of the Friday reality stress test, the multiple Thursday transition dinners, the multiple Tuesday sovereign publishing sessions, the multiple Monday AI briefings, all of which contribute to the validation process by providing the proposer with continuous operational feedback on the specific dimensions of their proposed life design that each community engagement makes relevant. The longitudinal dimension of the validation process is the dimension most directly enabled by the transition district's territorial commitment, the commitment to physical presence in a specific community over a sufficient duration, and most directly compromised by the transience of the digital nomad lifestyle and the retreat industry's time-limited program. A proposed life design cannot be adequately validated in a weekend. The operational feedback that genuine validation requires accumulates over weeks and months as the proposer attempts to execute elements of the proposed design within the community's ecosystem, observes the responses the execution generates, receives the community's assessment of those responses, adjusts the design, attempts the adjusted elements, observes the new responses, and iterates through the validation cycle with the specific combination of persistence and flexibility that genuine operational learning requires. The framework itself is organized into 4 interconnected processes that together constitute the full validation architecture. They are not sequential stages in the sense that each must be completed before the next can begin. They are concurrent processes that are always simultaneously in operation for any participant who is genuinely engaged in the dream validation framework, each informing and being informed by the others in the recursive dynamic of genuine operational learning. The first process is dream articulation, the specific, demanding, iterative process of moving from the general aspiration that the transitioning professional brings to the community toward the operationally specific description of the proposed life that the validation framework requires as its primary input. This process is more difficult than it appears because the general aspiration, the desire to write, to build, to create, to teach, to consult, to research, to lead, to design, is almost always the proposer's most comfortable level of self-description. Both because the general aspiration is genuinely felt and because the general aspiration is safely above the level of operational specificity at which the aspiration encounters the specific operational challenges that might reveal it to be more complicated than the aspiration's current form acknowledges. The dream articulation process requires the proposer to descend from the general aspiration to the operational specific to answer, in writing and in community conversation, questions of the following kind. What specifically will you be doing on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon 3 years from now, in the life you are proposing to build? What specifically will you not be doing that you are currently doing or currently expecting to do? Who specifically will be paying you, for what specifically, in what specific amounts, on what specific schedule, in exchange for what specific deliverable produced through what specific process? What specific community will you be embedded in? And how specifically will you have built the relationships within that community that make it a genuine community rather than a collection of acquaintances organized around a shared interest? What specific place will you be living in? And what specific commitments to that place will you have made that make it a territorial home rather than a current location? What specifically will you be producing in the cultural sense? What publications, what performances, what exhibitions, what teachings, what contributions to the governing mythology of the community you are part of? And how specifically will those productions be valued and sustained by the specific community you are producing them for? These questions are not comfortable. They are designed to be uncomfortable, because the comfort of the general aspiration is precisely the feature of the aspiration that prevents the aspiration from becoming an operational life design. The proposer who can answer all of these questions with genuine operational specificity, who can describe Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon 3 years from now not as working on my writing practice, but as editing the 3rd chapter of the 2nd issue of my quarterly publication, which is distributed to 420 subscribers at a subscription price of $12 per month, while preparing the outline for Thursday's transition dinner, which I am hosting and for which I have confirmed 8 participants from 3 different arrival cohorts, has completed the dream articulation process and is ready for the stress testing that the subsequent processes provide. The proposer who cannot yet answer these questions at this level of specificity has not completed the dream articulation process and is not yet ready for the stress testing, because the thing to be tested has not yet been articulated with sufficient operational specificity to make the testing possible. The most common failure mode of the dream articulation process is the premature termination of the articulation at the level of the general aspiration, which the proposer experiences as having completed the articulation because the aspiration is genuinely felt and genuinely important and genuinely specific at the aspirational level, without recognizing that the aspirational level of specificity is not the level at which the validation process operates and that the remaining distance between the aspirational description and the operational description is the distance that the validation process must traverse before genuine validation can occur. The community's role in the dream articulation process is the provision of the specific questions that the proposer has not yet thought to ask. The questions that arise from the community's operational knowledge of the specific domains the proposer is attempting to design their life around. The initiated practitioner who has built a sovereign publishing practice knows the specific questions that a proposed sovereign publishing practice must be able to answer to be operationally viable, and can therefore provide, in the Thursday transition dinner context or the Tuesday publishing session context or the informal conversation context, the specific prompts that move the proposer from the aspirational level to the operational level of description more efficiently than the proposer's own self-directed reflection would move them, because the initiated practitioner's questions arise from the specific operational experience that allows them to identify precisely the dimensions of the proposed design that the proposer has not yet made operationally specific and that the validation process most urgently requires to be made specific before it can proceed. The second process is failure mode mapping, the systematic identification, drawing on the community's accumulated operational knowledge of the specific domains the proposed design addresses, of the specific ways in which proposed life designs in those domains most commonly fail to survive contact with operational reality. Failure mode mapping is the process that most directly distinguishes the dream validation framework from the adjacent practice of dream affirmation, because failure mode mapping requires the honest acknowledgement and the detailed operational specification of the ways in which the proposed design might not work, the specific points of vulnerability, the specific external conditions under which the design becomes unviable, the specific internal conditions under which the proposer's own behavior is most likely to undermine the design's execution, and the specific sequence of events that transforms an initially plausible design into an unsustainable one through the accumulation of small miscalculations that individually seem manageable and collectively produce a failure that seems, in retrospect, obvious but that the proposer could not have identified without the specific knowledge of the failure mode that the mapping process provides. The failure mode map for a proposed sovereign publishing practice, developed with the specificity that the dream validation framework requires, would include approximately the following elements, each of which represents a specific point of vulnerability that the community's accumulated operational knowledge has identified through the observation of multiple attempts at the same or similar designs in similar conditions. The financial failure mode, the specific moment, typically between months 6 and 14 of the practice, at which the subscription revenue projected in the initial financial model has not materialized at the projected rate, and the proposer faces the choice between reducing the publication quality and frequency to the level the actual revenue can sustain, supplementing the publishing revenue with consulting or client work that the initial design had intended to eliminate, or drawing on financial runway that the initial design had not budgeted for the publishing practice's extended development phase. The audience development failure mode, the specific dynamic through which the initial subscriber cohort, recruited from the proposer's prior professional network, does not expand into the broader audience required to sustain the financial model at the scale the design requires, because the expansion requires a different kind of content and a different kind of distribution strategy than the content and distribution strategy that served the initial recruitment, and the proposer has not yet developed the specific skills of audience development beyond the initial network that the expansion requires. The content sustainability failure mode, the specific moment, typically between months 8 and 18, at which the proposer has exhausted the initial content framework that the publication was designed around and must either develop a significantly expanded intellectual framework to sustain continued publication, or reduce the publication's ambition to the level that the proposer's current intellectual framework can sustain without the innovation that would expand it. The identity crisis failure mode, the specific period, often coinciding with the financial stress period, at which the absence of the institutional validation that the proposer's prior professional identity depended on for its social legibility becomes acutely felt, and the proposer's commitment to the publishing practice wavers under the specific pressure of the comparison between the social status their institutional career provided and the social status that a nascent publishing practice with 400 subscribers provides to the people whose assessment of the proposer's social status the proposer most values. Each failure mode in the map is accompanied by the specific early warning signals that allow the failure to be identified before it reaches the point of being irreversible, and the specific responses, adjustments to the design, modifications to the execution, changes to the financial structure, supplements to the community support, that address the failure mode at the point of the early warning signal rather than at the point of the failure's completion. The failure mode map is therefore not primarily a discouraging document, though it will be experienced as discouraging by any proposer who has not yet fully internalized the distinction between the honest assessment of the design's vulnerabilities and the verdict on the design's worthiness. It is a navigational document, the map of the specific terrain the proposed life design will traverse, with the hazards marked and the alternative routes through those hazards identified. The navigator who has the map is not more likely to abandon the journey than the navigator without the map. They are more likely to complete it, because the map allows them to anticipate the specific difficulties that the mapless navigator encounters as surprises, and the anticipation allows the preparation that converts potentially fatal surprises into manageable challenges. The community's role in the failure mode mapping process is the contribution of the specific knowledge that makes the map accurate rather than speculative. The initiated practitioner who has encountered a specific failure mode in their own practice has a knowledge of that failure mode, its specific early warning signals, its specific precipitating conditions, its specific sequence of development from manageable difficulty to potentially irreversible crisis, that is not available from any secondary source. The initiated practitioner who has not encountered a specific failure mode in their own practice but who has observed it in the practices of people they have been in sustained community with has a knowledge of the failure mode that is secondhand but still operationally useful. The community's aggregate knowledge of the failure modes across all the domains its members' proposed life designs address is therefore significantly richer than any individual's knowledge of any single domain, and it is the aggregate that the failure mode mapping process draws on rather than any single practitioner's individual knowledge. The Thursday Transition Dinner is the primary vehicle for the aggregate's operation, the conversation in which the specific combination of participants around the specific table produces, through the specific dynamic of multiple perspectives applied to a specific case, a failure mode map that no single participant could have produced alone and that the proposer could not have produced through any amount of individual self-assessment. The third process is design modification, the iterative process through which the proposed life design is adjusted in response to the failure mode mapping to address the identified vulnerabilities while preserving, to the maximum extent possible, the specific aspirations and desires that generated the design in the first place. Design modification is the process in which the distinction between the dream that can survive operational reality and the dream that cannot is most clearly revealed and most urgently addressed, because it is the process in which the proposer must confront, directly and specifically, the specific elements of their proposed design that are not adequate to the operational reality the design will encounter and must decide, for each inadequate element, whether the inadequacy can be addressed through modification of the design or whether the inadequacy reveals a fundamental incompatibility between the specific aspiration and the specific operational conditions that makes the aspiration in its current form genuinely non-viable. The distinction between the two kinds of inadequacy, the inadequacy that modification can address and the inadequacy that reveals fundamental incompatibility, is the most important distinction the design modification process must make, and it is a distinction that is consistently more difficult to make in practice than it appears to be in principle. The second most common error is the reverse conflation, the treatment of addressable inadequacies as if they revealed fundamental incompatibilities, leading the proposer to abandon aspirations that are genuinely viable through appropriate modification in response to the discovery that the unmodified versions of those aspirations are not viable, a response that produces the premature abandonment of genuinely achievable dreams on the basis of the failure of their first operational formulation, rather than the modification of that formulation toward a version that is genuinely achievable. The second most common error is the reverse conflation, the treatment of addressable inadequacies as if they revealed fundamental incompatibilities, leading the proposer to abandon aspirations that are genuinely viable through appropriate modification in response to the discovery that the unmodified versions of those aspirations are not viable, a response that produces the premature abandonment of genuinely achievable dreams on the basis of the failure of their first operational formulation, rather than the modification of that formulation toward a version that is genuinely achievable. The community's role in the design modification process is the provision of the specific perspective that allows these two kinds of inadequacy to be distinguished in specific cases. The initiated practitioner who has navigated the specific domain the proposer is designing for has encountered both kinds of inadequacy in their own practice, has encountered the aspirations that were genuinely non-viable in any form and had to be genuinely released, and has encountered the aspirations that appeared non-viable in their initial formulation and turned out to be viable in modified forms that the modification process revealed. The ability to distinguish between the two kinds is one of the most operationally valuable capabilities the initiated practitioner brings to the dream validation framework, and it is a capability that can only be developed through the specific experience of having attempted both kinds of modification with both kinds of aspiration and having lived through the specific outcomes that the different kinds of inadequacy produced when they were treated as the same thing. The design modification process operates through the specific iterative structure that the transition district's weekly metabolism provides: the cycle of proposal, stress testing, honest assessment, modification, reproposal, renewed stress testing, and ongoing adjustment that the Friday reality stress test and the broader community engagement enable across the multiple weeks and months of the proposer's engagement with the community. The first iteration of the design modification process produces a modified design that addresses the most immediately obvious inadequacies identified in the initial failure mode mapping. The second iteration addresses the inadequacies that the first modification reveals or generates, because modifications to complex systems, including proposed life designs, often address one set of vulnerabilities while inadvertently creating others, and the ongoing iterative process is required to identify and address the second-order vulnerabilities that the first-order modifications produce. The subsequent iterations address the increasingly specific and increasingly subtle vulnerabilities that each preceding iteration reveals, converging through the accumulation of modifications that collectively address the design's most significant operational inadequacies without evacuating the aspirations that generated the design, toward the specific version of the proposed life design that is both genuinely true to the proposer's deepest aspirations and genuinely adequate to the operational conditions it will encounter. The fourth process is operational testing, the specific process through which elements of the modified proposed life design are actually implemented within the transition district's ecosystem, in a form sufficiently real to generate genuine operational feedback but sufficiently contained to make the feedback producible without the full investment of the proposer's financial runway and psychological capital that the full implementation would require. Operational testing is the process that most directly takes advantage of the transition district's specific territorial and community conditions that make genuine operational testing possible in ways that the retreats and the online communities and the individual self-reflection practices that constitute the dominant alternatives to the transition district's model are not able to make possible. The Tuesday Sovereign Publishing Session's Output-First culture is operational testing. The proposer who is designing a sovereign publishing practice does not merely discuss the design in the publishing session. They implement it, producing actual content for actual publication and distributing it to an actual audience within the community and beyond it, generating actual data about the content's reception, the community's engagement with it, the proposer's capacity to sustain the production pace the design requires, and the specific quality of the fit between the proposers, creative capabilities and the publishing practice's specific demands, all of which constitutes genuine operational feedback that the subsequent iteration of the design modification process can draw on. The Thursday transition dinner is operational testing of a different kind, the actual exercise of the specific social capabilities that the proposer's life design requires them to develop in the actual context of the genuine community relationships that the design depends on for its sustainable operation, generating actual feedback about the proposer's current level of those capabilities and the specific dimensions of their development that the design's demands most urgently require. The Monday AI Briefings discussion component is operational testing of the proposer's capacity to engage with the accelerating technological landscape at the level of operational relevance that the proposed life design requires. Testing not the proposer's capacity to understand the developments in the abstract, but their capacity to identify the specific implications of the developments for the specific operations of their specific proposed practice, which is the operational capability that the Monday Briefings community engagement makes available to test in real time. The Dreamcatcher protocol, referenced throughout this handbook and described in full operational specification in Appendix B, is the governing framework that organizes all four of these processes into a coherent, trackable, community-supported validation process, the specific instrument through which the Dream validation framework's abstract processes are converted into the concrete practices that a specific person in a specific stage of the transition can engage with in the specific context of the transition district's community. The protocol is not a questionnaire or a checklist or a scored assessment. It is a living document, maintained by the proposer in active engagement with the community's practitioners, that tracks the evolution of the proposed life design through the iterations of the Dream articulation, failure mode mapping, design modification, and operational testing processes, recording the specific modifications that each iteration produced and the specific operational evidence that motivated each modification, and making the evolution of the design visible to both the proposer and the community in a form that allows the community's practitioners to provide the most useful guidance at each stage of the validation process rather than the guidance most appropriate to the stage they assume the proposer is at based on insufficient information about the actual current state of the validation process. The protocol's most important function is not the documentation of the validation process's progress, though documentation serves important purposes both for the individual proposer and for the community's aggregate knowledge base. Its most important function is the maintenance of the proposer's honest engagement with the validation process across the specific periods of discouragement and doubt and cognitive resistance that the validation process reliably produces in the middle stages of its operation. The middle stages, the stages between the initial excitement of the dream articulation process and the consolidating confidence of the operational testing process's positive feedback, are the stages in which the failure mode mapping has revealed the specific inadequacies of the initial design and the design modification process has not yet produced a modified design whose operational viability is sufficiently established to provide the kind of grounded confidence that replaces the initial excitement. This is the valley of the validation process, and it is the valley in which the largest proportion of abandoned transitions are abandoned. Not because the aspiration was genuinely non-viable, but because the discovery of the initial design's inadequacies, without the community support and the iterative process that would reveal the modified design's genuine viability, produced a level of discouragement that the proposer interpreted as evidence that the transition itself was not viable rather than evidence that the transition's first formulation was not adequate to the operational conditions and needed to be modified toward a formulation that was. The community's role in maintaining the proposer's engagement through the valley is the most demanding and the most important function the Dream Validation Framework requires of the transition district's community. It is demanding because it requires the community to maintain its commitment to operational honesty, to resist the temptation to provide the encouraging affirmation that the proposer in the valley most immediately wants, in favor of the specific, honest, operationally grounded assessment that the proposer actually needs, at precisely the moment when the proposer's distress makes the encouraging affirmation feel most urgently necessary and the honest assessment feel most potentially cruel. It is important because the community's capacity to maintain operational honesty through the proposer's valley, to provide honest assessment with sufficient care and sufficient acknowledgement of the difficulty of the assessment's implications to make the assessment receivable rather than devastating, is the specific quality of support that most directly determines whether the transition district's Dream Validation Framework produces sovereign practitioners or adds to the extensive population of people who attempted the post-institutional transition, encountered the valley, did not receive the specific support that would have moved them through the valley rather than prompting them to exit it, and return to the institutional context or its nearest available substitute with the confirmation of their deepest fear, that the transition they wanted to make was one they were not capable of making, when in fact the transition they attempted was one that was not adequately supported. The distinction between these two outcomes, the supported transition that moves through the valley and the unsupported transition that exits through it, is the distinction between the Dream Validation Framework's success and the retreat industry's failure, and it is the distinction that the transition district's specific combination of territorial commitment, genuine community, initiated practitioner knowledge, and sustained programmatic support makes possible. The retreat sends the participant back into conditions that provide no support for moving through the valley, and the valley therefore typically determines the outcome. The transition district provides, through the ongoing engagement of the community's practitioners and the ongoing availability of the weekly metabolism and the ongoing operation of the Dreamcatcher protocol, the specific support that makes moving through the valley the natural outcome of sufficient sustained engagement rather than the exceptional outcome of unusual individual resilience. The Dream Validation Framework is therefore, in its deepest function, not a process for determining which dreams are viable and which are not, though it performs that function for a significant proportion of the proposed life designs that pass through it, revealing some aspirations to be genuinely non-viable in any operational form and others to be genuinely viable in modified forms that the proposer could not have identified without the validation process's rigorous operational engagement. It is a process for producing the specific quality of honest, grounded, community-tested confidence in a viable proposed life design that makes the transition from that design's proposal to its full implementation not an act of optimistic faith in an uncertain future but an act of informed commitment to a specific design whose operational viability has been rigorously established through the specific processes described in this chapter. The proposer who has completed the Dream Validation Framework's 4 processes, who has articulated the proposed design at the level of operational specificity that the framework requires, who has mapped the specific failure modes with the community's accumulated knowledge, who has modified the design through the iterative process that the Friday reality stress test and the broader community engagement enables, and who has tested the modified design's critical elements through the operational testing that the community's ecosystem provides, is not a person who is hoping that their proposed life design will work. They are a person who knows, with the specific quality of knowledge that only rigorous operational testing can produce, that the design they are about to implement is adequate to the conditions it will encounter, in the specific modified form that the validation process has produced, and that the specific challenges they will encounter in the implementation are challenges they have already encountered in miniature during the validation process and have already developed the specific capabilities required to navigate. That knowledge, that specific, honest, operationally grounded, community-tested confidence in the viability of a proposed life design is what the DREAM validation framework is designed to produce, and it is the specific quality of confidence that is most directly and most consequentially absent from the population of transitioning professionals who are currently attempting the post-institutional transition without adequate support. The absence of this confidence is the absence of the foundation on which genuine operational sovereignty is built. The DREAM validation framework is the process through which the foundation is constructed. The transition district is the community within which the framework operates. The Dreamcatcher protocol is the instrument through which the framework's abstract processes are converted into the concrete practices of a specific person's specific transition. And the sovereign practitioner who emerges from the framework's full operation, whose proposed life design has been articulated, stress-tested, modified, retested, and operationally validated with the rigor and the honesty and the community support that genuine validation requires, is the transition district's primary output and the living evidence of its governing claim, that the post-institutional transition is not only possible but achievable, in specific, operational, sustainable, genuinely sovereign form, by specific capable people who receive the specific support that the transition genuinely requires, rather than the inspiring but operationally inadequate alternatives that the existing infrastructure of personal development and community formation has been providing at scale, while consistently failing to deliver the results it promises. The DREAM is not validated by being affirmed. It is validated by being tested, modified, tested again, and found, in its modified form, adequate to the conditions it must survive. That is the framework. That is the work. The work is worth doing. The result is worth having. And the transition district is the place where the work can be done with the specific quality of support that makes the result achievable rather than merely aspirational. Part 3. The Architecture of ARRIVAL Chapter 16. Operational Sovereignty. Defined without romance. The word sovereignty has been doing a great deal of cultural work in the decade and a half since the phrase personal sovereignty entered the vocabulary of the post-institutional aspiration, and the work it has been doing is not, on the whole, the work that genuine sovereignty requires or that the people who most urgently need it are most served by. The word has migrated from the political philosophy context in which it had precise meaning, the specific quality of self-governance that distinguishes a political entity capable of making and enforcing its own laws from a political entity subject to the laws of an external authority, through the personal development context in which it acquired a layer of psychological meaning, the specific quality of self-determination that distinguishes a person who governs their own choices and values, from a person who defers those choices and values to an external authority, into the lifestyle branding context in which it has acquired a layer of aesthetic meaning that is sufficiently untethered from both the political and psychological meanings to function primarily as a signal of aspiration rather than a description of an achieved condition. The sovereign creator, the sovereign practitioner, the sovereign life, these phrases circulate in the vocabulary of the post-institutional aspiration with a frequency and a cultural authority that is approximately inversely proportional to their operational specificity, which is to say that they are used most frequently and with the greatest cultural authority in the contexts where they are least precisely defined and therefore least useful as guides for the specific decisions and specific practices that genuine sovereignty, whatever it actually means, actually requires. This handbook uses the word sovereignty throughout, and it is therefore obligated, in a chapter dedicated to the definition of the concept, to provide the definition that the rest of the handbook has been deploying without making fully explicit. The definition this chapter provides is not the aspirational definition, not the description of sovereignty as a condition of perfect self-determination unmarked by compromise, dependency, external constraint, or the specific forms of contingency that any life lived in actual relationship with an actual economy and an actual community and an actual physical environment necessarily involves. The definition this chapter provides is operational. It is a description of the specific practices, the specific economic conditions, the specific community relationships, the specific daily disciplines, and the specific psychological dispositions that constitute genuine sovereignty as it is actually achievable by actual people in actual circumstances, with all the messiness and the compromise and the contingency and the continued presence of constraint in modified forms that the actual achievement of genuine sovereignty involves, and that the aspirational definition systematically omits in the service of the aspiration's inspirational function. Operational sovereignty is the condition in which a person's primary obligations are to their own judgment, their own values, their own creative and intellectual commitments, and the specific community of people they have chosen to be in sustained relationship with, rather than to the institutional authority of an employer, a credentialing body, a platform's algorithmic preferences, or any other external system whose requirements must be met as a precondition for the person's continued access to the economic and social resources their life requires. This definition has several components that each require careful elaboration. The phrase primary obligations distinguishes operational sovereignty from the impossible condition of total independence from all external obligations, which is not sovereignty but solipsism. Not the self-governance of a capable agent in a social world, but the self-isolation of a person who has confused the absence of external obligation with the achievement of freedom, and who has therefore produced not a sovereign life but a diminished one, impoverished by the absence of the genuine mutual dependencies and genuine mutual accountabilities that make a life in a community something more than a life in a room. The person who has achieved operational sovereignty has external obligations to their readers or their clients or their collaborators or their community or their landlord or the tax authority of the jurisdiction they inhabit. But the external obligations they have are obligations they have chosen rather than obligations that have been imposed on them as the price of access to the economic and social resources their life requires. The distinction between chosen obligation and imposed obligation is the operational core of sovereignty, and it is a distinction that requires constant active maintenance rather than a condition once achieved and thereafter preserved without effort, because the external systems that have an interest in converting chosen obligations into imposed ones, the platforms that gradually shift from optional services to necessary infrastructure, the clients that gradually shift from occasional engagements to structural dependencies, the communities that gradually shift from chosen relationships to social obligations whose violation carries costs that make the obligations feel less and less chosen, are continuously operating on the sovereign person's conditions in directions that tend, if unresisted, to reproduce the forms of dependency that sovereignty is designed to transcend. The phrase own judgment, own values, own creative and intellectual commitments specifies the content of the sovereignty, the specific dimensions of the person's life over which their own authority is the governing authority. Judgment means the authority to determine what is true, what is good work, what is worth doing, and what is not, without the requirement to defer those determinations to an external authority that is positioned, by its institutional standing, to override the person's own assessment. Values means the authority to determine what matters, what is worth sacrificing for, and what is not worth compromising, without the requirement to subordinate those determinations to the values of an institution whose survival depends on the person's compliance with its operating logic. Creative and intellectual commitments means the authority to determine the direction, the form, the pace, and the standard of the person's creative and intellectual work, without the requirement to submit those commitments to the approval of an institutional gatekeeper whose institutional interests may or may not be aligned with the interests of the work's genuine quality and genuine relevance. The phrase chosen community of sustained relationship specifies the social dimension of sovereignty, the specific quality of the sovereign person's community that distinguishes it from the institutional community of the employed professional. The institutional community is inherited rather than chosen. It consists of the people who happen to inhabit the same institutional space as the institutional employee, organized by the institutional logic of departmental structure, project assignment, and managerial hierarchy rather than by the genuine mutual recognition and genuine mutual investment that constitute the foundation of a chosen community. The sovereign person's community is chosen. It consists of the people the sovereign person has identified, through genuine mutual encounter, as the specific people whose creative and intellectual and operational perspectives are most genuinely enriching to their own work and whose sustained relationship is most genuinely important to the quality and the meaning of their own life. This does not mean the chosen community is conflict-free or uncomplicated. Genuine chosen communities are neither, and the absence of conflict and complication is more often evidence of superficiality than of genuine quality in a community relationship. It means that the community's specific composition is the product of genuine active selection rather than institutional circumstance, and that the obligations the community generates are obligations the sovereign person has genuinely chosen rather than obligations imposed by the institution's organizational logic. The operational content of this definition, the specific practices and economic conditions and daily disciplines that the achievement and maintenance of genuine sovereignty requires, is the subject of the remainder of this chapter, and it is the content that is most consistently absent from the discussions of sovereignty that circulate in the vocabulary of the post-institutional aspiration. The aspirational discussion addresses the desirability of sovereignty and the possibility of sovereignty and the general orientation of the life toward sovereignty, without addressing the specific operational question of what sovereignty actually costs, what specific practices it requires, what specific economic conditions it depends on, what specific psychological dispositions it demands, and what specific failure modes it is vulnerable to in the conditions that the actual post-institutional professional is actually navigating. This chapter addresses those questions in the specific and honest form that the dream validation framework requires them to be addressed in. The economic conditions of operational sovereignty are the most immediately concrete dimension of the concept and the dimension that the aspirational discussion most consistently underspecifies, because the economic reality of sovereign practice is the dimension most likely to puncture the aspiration's inspirational atmosphere and most likely to produce the specific form of discouragement that motivates a return to the institutional context. The honest economic account of operational sovereignty begins with the following observation. The institutional employment contract, for all its identity costs and its dependency costs and its costs to the person's creative and intellectual autonomy, provided the employed professional with something of very significant practical value that the sovereign life does not automatically provide and that the sovereign practitioner must build, actively, systematically, and with sustained effort over a period that is typically longer than the aspirational discussion acknowledges, before the sovereign life becomes economically self-sustaining. What the institutional contract provided was economic regularity, the specific quality of income that arrives at a predictable frequency in a predictable amount, regardless of whether the specific work produced in the preceding period was better or worse than the period before, regardless of whether the specific clients or projects of the preceding period generated more or less revenue than projected, and regardless of whether the specific external economic conditions of the preceding period were more or less favorable to the institution's revenue generation than anticipated. Economic regularity is not the same as economic generosity. The institutional salary may be less than the sovereign practitioner's aspiration for their own income, and for many people it is, but it is a form of economic provision that the sovereign life does not automatically replicate and that the sovereign practitioner must deliberately construct through the specific architecture of their revenue model, their client relationships, their publication ecosystem, and their community standing. The construction of the sovereign economic architecture, the specific combination of revenue streams, client relationships, publication ecosystems, community economies, and financial reserves that produces the economic regularity that institutional employment previously provided, is the most operationally demanding aspect of the transition to sovereign practice and the aspect that the transition district's dream validation framework most directly addresses. The economic architecture of a genuinely sovereign practice is almost never a single revenue stream. The single revenue stream, the single client, the single platform, the single publication, the single consulting relationship, is the economic structure that most closely resembles the institutional employment it replaced, because the single revenue stream produces the same economic dependency that institutional employment produced, merely relocated from the institution to the single client or the single platform or the single publication. Genuine economic sovereignty requires a diversified economic architecture, multiple revenue streams that are sufficiently independent of each other in their economic logic that the failure or the contraction of any single stream does not produce an immediate and potentially catastrophic reduction in the sovereign practitioner's total income. The specific combination of revenue streams that constitutes an adequate diversification varies with the individual practitioner's specific capabilities and specific community relationships and specific geographic conditions, but the minimum condition of genuine diversification is the following. No single revenue stream should constitute more than 40% of the practitioner's total income, and at least 3 distinct revenue streams should be present in the architecture, where distinct means genuinely different in the economic logic that generates the revenue rather than merely different in the superficial form of the revenue's delivery. The development of a genuinely diversified sovereign economic architecture typically requires between 18 and 36 months from the beginning of the transition, and this timeline is the most important single piece of information that the Dream Validation Framework's failure mode mapping must convey to the uninitiated arrival who is designing their post-institutional life. The gap between the timeline that the aspirational discussion implies, the suggestion, common in the literature of the post-institutional aspiration, that the diversified sovereign economic architecture can be constructed in the months immediately following the departure from institutional employment, supported by the financial runway of the severance or the savings that the departure makes available, and the timeline that the operational experience of initiated practitioners consistently reveals is the single most common source of the catastrophic financial stress that produces the largest proportion of abandoned transitions. The uninitiated arrival who designs their post-institutional life on the basis of the aspirational timeline, who anticipates that the sovereign economic architecture will be self-sustaining within 6 months of the transition's initiation, will typically discover, at approximately the 8 to 12-month mark, that the architecture has not reached the self-sustaining threshold and that the financial runway required to maintain the architecture's development has been more substantially depleted than the initial design anticipated. At this point, the failure mode of premature institutional reentry becomes the dominant pressure. The specific combination of financial stress and psychological discouragement that produces the return to institutional employment not because the transition's eventual success is genuinely impossible, but because the transition's intermediate stage has been reached without the financial architecture that would sustain the transition through the intermediate stage to the eventual success. The transition district's role in addressing this failure mode is twofold. First, the Dream Validation Framework's failure mode mapping and design modification processes are specifically designed to surface the timeline miscalculation in the proposed design before the transition begins rather than after the financial runway has been partially depleted, providing the proposer with the specific opportunity to modify their financial architecture. By extending their financial runway before the transition, by identifying and developing revenue streams during the transition's early phases rather than expecting them to materialize after the formal institutional departure, or by staging the institutional departure more gradually than the clean break narrative of the post-institutional aspiration typically implies, in ways that make the 18 to 36-month development timeline survivable rather than catastrophically stressful. Second, the transition district's community economy. The specific economic relationships between community members that the community's concentrated population and shared programmatic life makes possible, provides a genuine supplementary economic resource for the transitioning professional in the intermediate stage, in the form of consulting relationships, collaborative projects, publication partnerships, and service exchanges within the community that can contribute to the diversification of the sovereign economic architecture during the period when the external revenue streams are still in the early stages of their development. The financial reserve, the specific quantity of liquid financial resources that the sovereign practitioner maintains as a buffer against the economic irregularity that is the inherent condition of the diversified sovereign economic architecture, is the most consistently underestimated cost of the transition to sovereign practice, and it deserves more specific attention than the aspirational discussion typically provides. The minimum adequate financial reserve for a sovereign practitioner in the early stages of their economic architecture's development, the stage during which the individual revenue streams are still in the process of establishing their recurring character and the architecture's total income is still subject to the significant month-to-month variation that the developing stage of any revenue-generating activity produces, is substantially larger than the minimum adequate financial reserve for an institutionally employed professional operating at the same annual income level. The institutionally employed professional's financial reserve is designed to cover the specific contingency of unexpected expenses and the specific contingency of the loss of the single income stream that constitutes their economic architecture, and the loss of the single income stream has a low probability in the short term and a well-defined character, the termination of employment that makes it plannable. The sovereign practitioner's financial reserve is designed to cover the ongoing, structural, non-contingent economic irregularity of a diversified economic architecture in which the total income of any given month may be anywhere from 60 to 140% of the average monthly income of the preceding 12 months, and the specific pattern of the variation is not fully predictable in advance because it is a function of the specific timing of the multiple revenue streams. Individual payment cycles, the specific character of the individual stream's seasonal variations, and the specific distribution of the collaborative and consulting relationships whose revenue is inherently project-based and therefore irregular in a way that the institutional salary is not. The specific reserve that the Transition District's Dream Validation Framework recommends, based on the aggregate operational experience of the community's initiated practitioners across their specific experiences of the sovereign economic architecture's development and operation, is a minimum of 12 months of the practitioner's proposed monthly expenditure at the time of the transition's initiation, maintained as a liquid reserve that is not included in the financial projections for the architecture's revenue development and not drawn on except in the specific circumstance of the total income from all revenue streams falling below the threshold required to cover the practitioner's monthly obligations. This reserve is not a contingency fund in the emergency sense. It is a structural component of the sovereign economic architecture, the specific instrument through which the architecture's inherent economic irregularity is converted from an existential threat to the transition into a manageable operational condition that the practitioner can navigate without the specific quality of financial panic that produces the premature institutional reentry failure mode. The practitioner who enters the transition without this reserve, or with a reserve that falls substantially short of the 12-month minimum, is a practitioner whose transition is operating under a structural economic vulnerability that the Dream Validation Framework's design modification process should identify and address before the transition begins. The daily disciplines of operational sovereignty are the specific practices that the sovereign practitioner engages in as the non-negotiable structural elements of their daily life that maintain the conditions of sovereignty against the continuous pressure of the forces that tend to erode those conditions over time. These disciplines are less visible than the economic architecture and less dramatic than the community relationships and less mythologically resonant than the creative and intellectual commitments, but they are more immediately determinative of the sovereignty's day-to-day quality than any of these more visible elements, because the quality of any day's work and any day's sovereignty is primarily a function of the specific practices through which that day is structured rather than the grand features of the architecture within which the day occurs. The first and most foundational of the daily disciplines is what this handbook calls temporal sovereignty, the practice of structuring one's own time in accordance with one's own assessment of what the day's most important work is, rather than in accordance with the demands, requests, and expectations of the external systems that have an interest in claiming the practitioner's time for their own purposes. Temporal sovereignty is the sovereignty that is most immediately visible in the daily experience of the transition from institutional to post-institutional life. The sovereignty of the morning that is not organized by a commute and a meeting schedule and a manager's expectations but by the practitioner's own assessment of what the morning's most important work is, and it is the sovereignty that is most immediately experienced as both the transition's primary liberation and its primary challenge. The liberation is the genuine relief of the morning that belongs to the practitioner's own priorities rather than the institution's. The challenge is the specific cognitive and motivational demands of determining, every morning without exception and without the institutional structure that previously made the determination automatic, what the morning's most important work actually is, and then doing that work without the external accountability structure that previously enforced the doing in the form of deadlines, meetings, managers' expectations, and the ambient social pressure of colleagues whose visible engagement with their own work produced the specific social obligation to be equally visibly engaged with one's own. The practice of temporal sovereignty requires the development of a specific internal accountability structure that replaces the external accountability structure of institutional employment. This internal accountability structure is not a matter of willpower. The framing of temporal sovereignty as primarily a willpower challenge is one of the most counterproductive framings available, because it produces the specific form of self-blame when the willpower is insufficient that is both psychologically damaging and operationally unhelpful, directing the practitioner's attention toward the inadequacy of their internal resources rather than toward the inadequacy of the structural conditions that would make the internal resources adequate. The internal accountability structure is a matter of design, the specific design of the daily schedule, the weekly rhythm, the project milestones, the community commitments, and the publication deadlines that together produce the specific combination of self-generated urgency and community-generated accountability that makes the consistent engagement with the day's most important work the path of least resistance rather than the heroic achievement of exceptional willpower. The transition district's weekly metabolism is, in this respect, the most important structural support for the daily discipline of temporal sovereignty that the community provides. The Monday briefing creates the weekly orientation that the institutional Monday meeting used to create, the specific engagement with the week's context that converts the open-endedness of the sovereign week into a week with a specific beginning. The Tuesday publishing session creates the specific weekly production deadline that the institutional project deadline used to create, the specific accountability of the committed output that converts the sovereign practitioner's open-ended creative time into time with a specific deliverable at its end. The Friday reality stress test creates the specific weekly accountability for the proposed life design's ongoing development that no institutional structure previously provided, the specific community engagement with the practitioner's progress toward their self-defined objectives that replaces the institutional performance review's external accountability with the community accountability that the sovereign life requires in its place. The cumulative effect of the weekly metabolism structure is the specific temporal architecture that temporal sovereignty requires. A week with enough rhythm and enough commitment and enough community accountability to make consistent engagement with the most important work the natural default of the week's organization rather than the exceptional achievement of the exceptional week. The second daily discipline is what this handbook calls epistemic sovereignty, the practice of maintaining one's own assessment of what is true, what is good work, and what is worth doing, against the continuous pressure of the external systems that have an interest in determining those assessments on the practitioner's behalf. Epistemic sovereignty is the dimension of sovereignty that the institutional context most systematically suppressed. The condition of the institutional professional is, in significant part, the condition of a person who has delegated the authority to determine what is good work to the institution's evaluation system, what is true to the institution's knowledge management system, and what is worth doing to the institution's priority-setting system, and who has therefore gradually lost, through the specific atrophy that any unexercised capacity undergoes, the specific confidence in their own epistemic authority that the exercise of that authority requires. The recovery of epistemic sovereignty is therefore not merely the reassertion of a right that was temporarily surrendered, it is the rehabilitation of a capacity that was significantly diminished by the sustained practice of epistemic deference that institutional employment required and rewarded. The practice of epistemic sovereignty in the daily life of the sovereign practitioner consists primarily in the maintenance of a regular, disciplined, self-directed engagement with the specific intellectual domains that the practitioner's creative and intellectual commitments require them to maintain genuine expertise in, not the consumption of the content that the platform's algorithmic curation delivers to the practitioner's attention, which is the content that the platform has determined. Will maximize the practitioner's engagement with the platform rather than the content that the practitioner's own epistemic authority has determined is most important for the development of their specific intellectual commitments, but the deliberate, active, self-directed engagement with the specific bodies of knowledge and the specific intellectual debates and the specific creative precedents that the practitioner's own assessment of their intellectual obligations requires them to be genuinely conversant with. This distinction between algorithmically delivered content consumption and self-directed intellectual engagement is one of the most operationally significant distinctions in the daily practice of epistemic sovereignty, and it is one of the distinctions that the Transition District's Monday AI briefing is specifically designed to support through the provision of a community-organized, expert-facilitated summary of the most operationally relevant developments in the accelerating technological landscape that the sovereign practitioner is navigating, a summary that supplements rather than replaces the practitioner's own self-directed intellectual engagement with the domains their specific practice requires. The third daily discipline is what this handbook calls relational sovereignty, the practice of maintaining one's chosen community of genuine mutual relationship as a primary commitment rather than a secondary activity that occurs in the time remaining after the primary activities of economic production and creative work have been attended to. Relational sovereignty is the discipline that is most counterintuitive for the institutionally formed professional, because the institutional context organized community as infrastructure, as the background condition of the institutional workplace that existed whether or not the individual invested in it actively, rather than as a primary commitment that requires active, sustained, prioritized investment to maintain. The sovereign practitioner who treats the community as infrastructure, who attends the Thursday transition dinner when the week's production schedule permits and skips it when it does not, who engages with the Tuesday publishing session when their own publication is in an active development phase and withdraws from it when their publication is in a maintenance phase, who participates in the Monday briefing when the week's AI developments seem directly relevant to their specific practice, and opts out when they seem peripheral, is a sovereign practitioner who is reproducing the institutional professional's passive relationship to community in the sovereign context, and is therefore foregoing the specific quality of genuine community relationship that the sovereignty's most important and most fragile social foundation requires. The practice of relational sovereignty requires the specific discipline of treating the community's programmatic commitments as structurally non-negotiable rather than scheduling them in competition with the week's production obligations and consistently losing that competition, which is what production obligations do to community obligations when the two are treated as competing rather than complementary priorities. The community's programmatic commitments are not in competition with the production obligations. They are the social infrastructure that makes the production obligations achievable in sustainable form, providing the specific combination of peer engagement, honest feedback, community accountability, and incidental intellectual stimulation that the sovereign practitioner requires for the long-term maintenance of the creative and intellectual energy that the production obligations depend on. The practitioner who withdraws from the community's programmatic commitments in the service of the week's production obligations is the practitioner who is depleting the social infrastructure that makes production sustainably possible, and who will discover, at the point when the depletion becomes critically advanced, that the production obligations cannot be met without the social infrastructure because the production was always, in ways the practitioner was not consciously tracking, dependent on the specific quality of the community engagement that the programmatic commitments were providing. The fourth daily discipline is what this handbook calls territorial sovereignty, the practice of maintaining a genuine, embodied, sustained relationship to the specific physical place that the sovereign practitioner has committed to inhabiting, in a form that produces the specific quality of territorial identity described in Part 1's treatment of why geography is not optional. Territorial sovereignty is the discipline most neglected by the nomadic culture of the digital nomad era, and its neglect is one of the most significant contributors to the nomadic lifestyle's failure to produce genuine operational sovereignty rather than the geographic freedom that it delivered. The sovereign practitioner who does not maintain the discipline of genuine territorial commitment, who maintains the nomadic option as an always available alternative to the specific challenges of the specific place they are currently inhabiting, and who therefore never fully invests the sustained attention and the sustained relationship building and the sustained community formation that territorial sovereignty requires, is a sovereign practitioner whose sovereignty is incomplete in the most foundational respect. They have not built the territorial foundation without which the other dimensions of sovereignty are socially ungrounded and therefore perpetually vulnerable to the specific form of rootlessness that the nomadic lifestyle confuses with freedom. The specific practice of territorial sovereignty consists in the daily, embodied engagement with the specific place and the specific community that the transition district provides. The morning walk through the pedestrian corridors that develops the specific quality of spatial attention described in Part 1. The daily participation in the community's common spaces that develops the specific mutual recognition and mutual knowledge that territorial identity requires. The sustained investment in the specific relationships with the specific people and the specific businesses and the specific social institutions of the district that converts the practitioner's presence in the district from a current location into a genuine territorial home. This investment is not glamorous. It is the specific unglamorous work of showing up in the same place with the same people on the same schedule, day after day, until the accumulated presence becomes the specific quality of belonging that no amount of inspired temporary presence can produce and that the nomadic lifestyle's perpetual newness systematically prevents. The psychological dispositions of operational sovereignty are the specific qualities of character and cognitive orientation that the successful sovereign practitioner develops through the sustained practice of the daily disciplines and the sustained navigation of the failure modes and the sustained engagement with the community's honest assessment culture that the transition district provides. They are not prerequisites for beginning the transition. The person who waits until they have developed all the psychological dispositions of operational sovereignty before beginning the transition will wait indefinitely, because the dispositions are products of the transition's practice rather than conditions of its initiation. But they are destinations, specific qualities of character that the transition is designed to produce through its practice, and that the practitioner who has genuinely traversed the transition's full arc, supported by the community and the framework and the territorial commitment that the transition district provides, will have developed to a degree substantially greater than the practitioner who began the same transition without adequate support. The first is tolerance for genuine ambiguity, not the performed tolerance of the aspiring sovereign who has decided that ambiguity is good and uncertainty is liberating and the absence of external validation is a positive feature of the sovereign life rather than a specific form of deprivation that must be actively compensated for, but the genuine tolerance that develops through the sustained experience of navigating genuine ambiguity with genuine equanimity over sufficient time and through sufficient iterations of the ambiguity's production and the navigation's success to have developed a genuine, evidence-based confidence that ambiguity is navigable rather than a merely philosophical conviction that ambiguity should be tolerable. The distinction between the performed tolerance and the genuine tolerance is detectable unfailingly by the initiated practitioner who has developed genuine tolerance and who can therefore recognize its absence in the person performing it, can recognize the specific quality of the performed equanimity that is actually a sustained effort of will rather than a naturally arising emotional state, and can provide the specific honest feedback that the person performing the tolerance needs to hear, and that the aspirational culture systematically withholds in the name of positive reinforcement. The second is the specific form of confidence that this handbook calls grounded confidence, the quality of self-assurance that is based on the specific, accumulated, operationally tested evidence of the practitioner's own capabilities and the practitioner's own design's viability, rather than the institutional validation that previously provided the external foundation for the practitioner's sense of their own professional standing. Grounded confidence is not arrogance. It does not claim more than the evidence supports. And it is not the performed confidence of someone who has decided that confidence is strategically appropriate regardless of the evidence. It is the specific quality of honest self-assessment that the dream validation framework's four processes produce in the practitioner who has engaged with them genuinely, the quality of someone who knows, from specific operational evidence rather than from aspiration or from external validation, what they are genuinely capable of and what the specific limits of their current capabilities are, and what specific development of those limits the community's practice is making possible. The third is recursive resilience, the specific quality of the practitioner's relationship to failure that develops through the sustained experience of the sovereign life's failure modes and the sustained practice of navigating them without catastrophizing the failure or minimizing its operational significance. Recursive resilience is not the bounce-back resilience of the motivational literature, not the quality of springing back from failure as if the failure left no mark and generated no knowledge. It is the quality of using the failure's specific knowledge, the specific operational information that the failure generated about the specific inadequacies of the specific design elements that failed, as the primary input for the next iteration of the design modification process, so that the failure's consequence is not merely the negative outcome it immediately produced but the specific improvement to the design that the failure's specific information makes possible. This is the recursive quality of resilience. Not the mere recovery from failure but the conversion of failure into design improvement, so that each failure generates the specific knowledge that makes the subsequent iteration of the design more robust in the specific dimension that the failure revealed as inadequate. The fourth is what might be called civilizational seriousness, the quality of engaging with the project of sovereign life not merely as a personal lifestyle choice but as a contribution to the specific historical project of demonstrating, through the lived practice of a specific community in a specific place at a specific historical moment, that the post-institutional transition is both possible and worth making, and that the world that comes after the institutional contract's dissolution is a world worth building rather than merely a world worth surviving. Civilizational seriousness is the disposition that distinguishes the transition district's culture from the culture of the post-institutional aspiration at its most individually focused, the disposition that keeps the community's governing mythology alive as a genuine organizing commitment rather than a decorative framing for what is ultimately a collection of individual self-interest projects organized around the coincidence of geographic proximity. It is the disposition that makes the Thursday Transition Dinner's honest account not merely a service the initiated practitioner provides to the uninitiated arrival, but a contribution to the community's collective knowledge base and the community's collective mythological development that matters beyond the specific individuals at the table. And it is the disposition that this handbook is ultimately written to cultivate, the disposition that recognizes in the specific, difficult, unglamorous, daily practice of operational sovereignty the specific historical significance of building, in the specific place and at the specific moment that the confluence of conditions this handbook has described makes available, the first genuinely functional prototype for the civilizational infrastructure that the world that comes after institutional employment is going to require. Operational sovereignty, defined without romance, is this: the daily practice of chosen obligation over imposed obligation, maintained through the specific disciplines of temporal, epistemic, relational, and territorial sovereignty, supported by the specific economic architecture that the Dream Validation Framework is designed to produce, embedded in the specific community of genuine peer relationship that the transition district provides, grounded in the specific territorial commitment that genuine belonging requires, and oriented toward the specific historical project of demonstrating, through its own practice, that the post-institutional life is not merely an aspiration but an achievable, sustainable, and genuinely meaningful form of human existence. It is more difficult than the aspiration suggests. It is more possible than the failure rate of unsupported transitions implies. And it is more important than the individual practitioner's personal interest in their own professional future, which is why the transition district is not merely a personal development environment but a civilizational prototype, and why the people who build their sovereign practices within it are not merely solving their own post-institutional problem but demonstrating, through the lived specificity of their daily practice, the specific form that the solution to that problem takes when it is genuinely supported by the specific community and the specific territory and the specific governing framework that genuine support actually requires. Part 3. The Architecture of ARRIVAL Chapter 17. From Consumer to Contributor. The Conversion Arc. There is a moment in the life of every person who successfully completes the transition from institutional employment to operational sovereignty that is, in retrospect, identifiable as the moment at which the transition became irreversible. Not irreversible in the sense that the person could not subsequently have returned to institutional employment, because the practical possibility of that return persists for most sovereign practitioners much longer than the aspiration to make it. But irreversible in the sense that the person's relationship to their own life and their own work and their own community had been sufficiently transformed by the transitions practice that the return to institutional employment would have required not merely a change of professional arrangement but a fundamental regression of identity, a reversal of the specific psychological development that the transition had produced, a dismantling of the specific capabilities and the specific dispositions and the specific quality of community relationship that the transitions practice had built, a surrender of the specific quality of genuine self-authorship that the transition had made available in exchange for the specific quality of institutional provision that the return would restore. The moment is rarely dramatic in its external presentation. It does not typically occur at a specific identifiable event, not at the publication of the first subscriber-funded essay or the completion of the first consulting engagement generated entirely through community relationship rather than institutional referral or the first Friday reality stress test in which the practitioner is the experienced assessor rather than the nervous presenter. It occurs in the specific interior shift from the posture of someone who is receiving the community support toward the posture of someone who is contributing to it, from the orientation of the consumer of the transition district's cultural and programmatic offerings toward the orientation of the contributor to those offerings' ongoing production. This shift from consumer to contributor is the central developmental transition of the transition district experience, and it is the subject of this chapter's analysis. It is not the same as the completion of the transition to operational sovereignty, which may or may not have been fully achieved at the moment the consumer to contributor shift occurs. It is the specific inflection point in the transitions arc at which the person's primary orientation to the community changes from the orientation of receiving to the orientation of giving. Not because the person has stopped receiving from the community, which they continue to do throughout the arc and which is appropriate and sustainable because the community's value to the sovereign practitioner does not diminish at the consumer to contributor threshold, but because the person's primary sense of their own identity within the community has shifted from the identity of someone who is being served by the community's infrastructure to the identity of someone who is serving it through their own genuine contribution to its ongoing production. The shift matters beyond its significance to the individual who experiences it because it is the specific mechanism through which the community's culture is sustained across generations of membership. The community that produces a consistent proportion of consumer-to-contributor conversions among its arriving population is a community whose cultural production capacity grows with its membership rather than declining. A community in which each new generation of arriving uninitiated practitioners eventually produces its own cohort of contributing practitioners, who add to the community's aggregate cultural output and its aggregate operational knowledge base and its aggregate community formation capacity rather than merely consuming from the fixed pool of those resources that the founding cohort established. The community that fails to produce consumer-to-contributor conversions at a sufficient rate is a community whose founding cohort is perpetually exhausted by the demands of supporting an expanding population of consumers without a corresponding expansion of the contributing population, until the founding cohort's depletion produces the specific failure mode of the founding generation collapse, the moment at which the people who established the community's culture and maintained its programmatic infrastructure simultaneously reach the end of their capacity to sustain the unreciprocated provision of those services and withdraw, producing a community that has a large consuming population and no one with the cultural authority or the operational knowledge to maintain the quality of what the consuming population is consuming. The conversion arc, the specific developmental trajectory that converts an arriving uninitiated consumer into a contributing community member, is not a uniform process. Its pace varies with the individual, its specific inflection points vary with the individual's specific prior experience and specific capabilities and specific relationship to the community's culture, and its specific form, the specific ways in which the converted contributor eventually contributes, varies with the individual's specific strengths and the community's specific current needs. But it has a recognizable structure that is consistent enough across the variation in its individual instantiations to be described with sufficient generality to be useful as a framework for the community's design of the conditions that support the arc's completion, and this structure is what this chapter is concerned with mapping. The arc begins, as the preceding chapters of this handbook have described in the contexts of the staged cognitive acclimatization framework and the dream validation framework, with the atmospheric reception phase's welcome into the community's ambient conditions and the contextual orientation phase's introduction to the community's governing vocabulary and programmatic culture. The specific contribution of these phases to the conversion arc is the establishment of the psychological safety and the cultural orientation that are the prerequisites for the conversion arc's subsequent phases. The specific conditions without which the conversion arc cannot proceed because the person who is not psychologically safe in the community and not oriented to the community's culture cannot begin to contribute to it, any more than a person who does not yet speak a language can contribute to a conversation in that language. The atmospheric reception and contextual orientation phases are therefore not merely the arrival process's first stages in the temporal sense. They are the conversion arc's foundational infrastructure, the specific conditions that make the subsequent stages of the arc achievable rather than merely aspirational. The arc's first genuinely developmental stage, the stage in which the movement from consumption to contribution begins to be initiated, however tentatively and however incompletely, is what this chapter calls the tentative offering. The tentative offering is the specific act through which the arriving person first contributes something genuine to the community's life. Not the performance of contribution, not the statement of intention to contribute, not the enthusiastic endorsement of the community's culture and the declaration of the arriving person's commitment to contributing to it, but an actual contribution of actual substance to an actual community activity. It is tentative because the person making it is not yet confident that their specific contribution is of sufficient quality or relevance to be genuinely valuable to the community rather than merely charitably received. And the tentativeness is a genuine psychological condition that the community's response to the offering must address with the specific combination of genuine honest assessment and genuine warm reception that distinguishes the transition district's culture from both the affirmational culture that would overpraise the offering in the service of the contributor's confidence and the critically demanding culture that would assess the offering against standards the tentative contributor has not yet had the opportunity to develop. The tentative offering typically takes one of three primary forms in the transition district's context, depending on the specific capabilities and the specific psychological readiness of the person making it. The first form is the contribution of operational knowledge, the sharing, in the Thursday transition dinner context or the Monday briefing context or the informal conversation context, of a specific piece of operational knowledge that the arriving person has accumulated in their prior professional life and that is genuinely relevant to the operational challenges of one or more of the community's other members. This is the form of tentative offering that is most accessible to the arriving professional with a substantial institutional career history, because the institutional career produces a substantial accumulation of operational knowledge across a range of domains that the community's other members may not have direct experience of, and the sharing of that knowledge, the account of what specific organizational dynamics produce specific failure modes in corporate strategy processes, or what Specific client relationship patterns generate the specific fee negotiation challenges that the independent consultant encounters. Or what specific editorial selection criteria govern the specific publications that the sovereign publisher is attempting to place work with, is a genuine contribution to the community's operational knowledge base that requires no prior development of sovereign practice to make, and that is genuinely valuable regardless of the contributor's current stage of their own transition. The second form is the contribution of creative or intellectual production, the actual submission, in the Wednesday Parallel Civilization Night context or the Tuesday Publishing Session context, of a creative or intellectual work that the arriving person has produced and that is offered for the community's genuine engagement rather than its charitable reception. The community's response to this form of tentative offering must be particularly carefully managed. Not managed in the sense of being made artificially gentle, which would undermine the honest assessment culture that the community depends on for its creative quality, but managed in the sense of being delivered through the community's specific culture of honest care, rather than the culture of honest harshness that some communities confuse with intellectual rigor. The community's response to this form of tentative offering must be particularly carefully managed. Not managed in the sense of being made artificially gentle, which would undermine the honest assessment culture that the community depends on for its creative quality, but managed in the sense of being delivered through the community's specific culture of honest care, rather than the culture of honest harshness that some communities confuse with intellectual rigor. The third form is the contribution of presence, the specific form of contribution available to the arriving person who does not yet have the operational knowledge or the creative production to offer in the preceding forms but who has the capacity to offer, through their genuine, attentive, honest presence in the community's programming, the specific quality of engaged audience that is itself a genuine contribution to the community's cultural production. The Wednesday Parallel Civilization Night requires not only performers but genuine audience, people whose responses and whose questions and whose honest engagement with the speculative narratives being presented constitute the specific social feedback that makes the night's cultural production consequential rather than merely performative. The Monday briefing requires not only facilitators but genuine participants, people whose honest questions and genuine responses to the week's developments constitute the specific intellectual engagement that makes the briefing's communal intelligence greater than any individual's contribution to it. The presence contribution is the most accessible form of tentative offering and the one most consistently undervalued by communities that equate contribution with production and therefore systematically fail to recognize the specific quality of genuine engaged presence as a form of contribution with its own genuine value. The conversion arc second stage is what this chapter calls the discovery of consequence. The specific experience, typically occurring in the period following several tentative offerings and the community's genuine responses to them, in which the arriving person first understands, in a way that is felt rather than merely intellectually recognized, that their contribution to the community's life has made a specific, identifiable, genuine difference to a specific, identifiable, genuine other person's experience. The discovery of consequence is a critical inflection point in the conversion arc because it addresses the specific psychological challenge that the conversion from consumer to contributor most consistently encounters in the transition district's context. The challenge of finding the contribution meaningful in its own right rather than merely as an instrument of the contributing person's own development. The consumer's relationship to the community is necessarily self-referential. The consumer assesses the community's offerings in terms of their value to the consumer's own transition, their contribution to the consumer's own development, their service to the consumer's own needs. The contributor's relationship to the community must also include a genuinely other-referential dimension, must include the experience of finding the contribution meaningful because of what it does for the other person rather than exclusively because of what it does for the contributor's own sense of self-efficacy or self-esteem. The discovery of consequence is the specific experience that initiates the development of this other-referential dimension. It is the experience of being told, in the specific honest and unperformed way that the transition district's culture of genuine engagement makes possible, that the specific account the contributor gave at the Thursday dinner, the specific honest description of the specific failure mode they encountered at the specific moment in their own transition, was the specific thing that the person who received the account needed to hear at the specific moment they needed to hear it, and that the account's consequence for that person was not the generic inspiration that the affirmational culture would produce but the specific operational modification of the specific element of their proposed life design that was most urgently in need of modification. This experience, the experience of having contributed something operationally specific to a specific person's specific navigation of a specific challenge, in a way that made the navigation meaningfully easier or the outcome meaningfully better, is qualitatively different from the experience of having been told that one's contribution was appreciated or inspiring or valuable in general terms, because it is specific and therefore verifiable and therefore genuinely informative about the actual quality and the actual relevance of the contribution in a way that the generic appreciation is not. The discovery of consequence through specific feedback is the experience that converts the contribution from a rehearsal of the contributing person's desire to be a contributing community member into the genuine practice of contribution as an activity that is valuable independently of the contributor's desire to be seen as a contributing community member. The conversion arc's third stage is what this chapter calls the development of contribution identity, the specific stage in which the arriving person's primary self-identification within the community shifts from the identification of someone who is being supported by the community toward the identification of someone who is contributing to it. This shift is gradual and rarely consciously noticed at the moment it is occurring. It is the specific kind of identity development that is typically only recognizable in retrospect, when the person reflects on the quality of their relationship to the community at different points in their arc and identifies the specific period during which their primary orientation shifted. The development of contribution identity is the stage at which the conversion arc's psychological work is most directly engaged, because it requires the arriving person to relinquish the specific psychological protection of the consumer identity, the identity that positions the arriving person as someone whose primary obligation is to their own transition and whose engagement with the community is therefore always legitimately accessible against the standard of whether the engagement is serving the transition, and to take on the specific psychological responsibility of the contributor identity, which positions the arriving person as someone whose obligations extend beyond their own transition to include the obligations of the community member whose presence and participation other community members are depending on. The psychological shift from consumer identity to contributor identity is facilitated by the community's specific culture of graduated expectation, the specific ambient norm that the transition district's culture maintains, through the initiated practitioner's embodied demonstration and the governing framework's explicit articulation, that the arriving person's graduation through the staged cognitive acclimatization framework's phases is not merely their own developmental achievement but the community's investment in the development of a future contributing member, and that the specific investment the community has made in the arriving person's transition creates a specific reciprocal obligation to contribute to the community's ongoing life and ongoing capacity to make comparable investments in subsequent arrivals. This norm is not enforced through explicit obligation or formal expectation management. The community that enforces contribution through explicit obligation is the community that converts genuine voluntary commitment into resentful compliance, which is neither genuinely contributory nor genuinely sovereign. It is maintained through the ambient quality of the community's culture, through the visible example of the initiated practitioner's own contribution to the community's life, and through the specific quality of relationship that develops between the arriving person and the community's members through the genuine engagement of the preceding conversion arc stages. The specific quality of relationship that makes the contribution feel like reciprocity rather than obligation, like the natural expression of the community investment that one has genuinely benefited from rather than the institutional compliance with a rule one has been required to follow. The fourth stage is what this chapter calls the consolidation of contribution practice, the stage in which the converted contributor develops the specific regular practices through which their contribution to the community's life becomes a structural element of their weekly rhythm rather than a series of individually chosen occasions for contribution. The consolidation stage is the stage at which the consumer-to-contributor conversion becomes durably established rather than provisionally achieved, the stage at which the contribution is no longer dependent on the contributor's moment-to-moment motivational state, but is instead embedded in the temporal architecture of the contributor's sovereign practice in a form that makes the contribution as structurally present as the Tuesday publishing session or the Monday briefing or any other element of the weekly metabolism that the contributor has incorporated into the structural rhythm of their productive life. The specific forms of consolidated contribution vary enormously with the individual contributor's specific capabilities and specific community role, but they share the common feature of being regular rather than occasional, embedded rather than contingent, and reciprocal in the double sense that they provide genuine value to the community while simultaneously providing genuine value to the contributor's own ongoing development. The initiated practitioner who consistently co-facilitates the Thursday transition dinner is consolidating their contribution to the community's knowledge transfer function while simultaneously consolidating their own development of the specific capability of honest peer facilitation that their sovereign practice requires for its ongoing operational quality. The contributor who consistently produces for the Tuesday publishing session is consolidating their contribution to the community's cultural production ecosystem while simultaneously consolidating their own development of the specific discipline of regular creative production that their sovereign publishing practice requires. The contributor who consistently participates in the Monday briefings discussion component is consolidating their contribution to the community's collective intelligence about the technological landscape while simultaneously consolidating their own development of the specific practice of applied technological awareness that their sovereign practice's continued relevance requires. The fifth stage, which is less a discrete stage of the conversion arc than the condition that the arc's completion produces and that constitutes the arc's genuine destination, is what this chapter calls sovereign contribution, the stage described in the preceding chapter on staged cognitive acclimatization, in which the converted contributor's engagement with the community is no longer organized by the arc of their own transition and development but by the ongoing, mature, genuinely mutual relationship between their own sovereign practice and the community's collective life. The sovereign contributor is not a person who has finished developing. The sovereign practitioner's development is, as the preceding chapter's treatment of operational sovereignty established, a permanent condition rather than a completed achievement. The sovereign contributor is a person whose development and whose contribution are sufficiently integrated that the distinction between the two is no longer the organizing principle of their relationship to the community. A person who contributes to the community not as an expression of their desire to be a good community member and not as a fulfillment of the reciprocal obligation created by the community's prior investment in their transition, but as the natural expression of a mature relationship between a sovereign practitioner and the specific community within which their sovereignty is most fully exercised, most honestly assessed, and most genuinely supported. The conversion arc's full trajectory, from arriving uninitiated consumer through tentative offering and discovery of consequence and contribution identity development and contribution practice consolidation to sovereign contribution, is the transition district's primary civilizational achievement, and it is worth dwelling briefly on the specific nature of that achievement before this chapter and part 3 of the handbook conclude. The achievement is not primarily the production of sovereign practitioners, though the production of sovereign practitioners is genuine and important and the primary visible output of the transition district's program. The primary civilizational achievement is the demonstration, through the accumulation of completed conversion arcs across multiple generations of arriving uninitiated practitioners, that the post-institutional transition is not merely the idiosyncratic achievement of unusually capable or unusually resilient individuals who would have completed the transition in any circumstances and with any level of support. It is a repeatable, teachable, community-supportable process whose successful completion rate is a function of the quality of the support provided rather than the exceptional quality of the individual undergoing the transition, and that can therefore be institutionalized, embedded in the specific cultural and programmatic and governance structures of a specific territorial community in a specific place, in a form that produces consistent, successful outcomes across the genuinely diverse population of arriving uninitiated practitioners who constitute the next migration's human reality. This demonstration is the transition district's most important contribution to the broader civilizational project of developing the infrastructure for the world that comes after institutional employment. The world after institutional employment needs not merely the proof that sovereign practice is possible. The proof of concept has been established at small scale and in individual cases throughout the history of the post-institutional aspiration. It needs the proof that sovereign practice is scalable, that the infrastructure for producing sovereign practitioners can be designed, built, and sustained in a form that serves not just the exceptional individual but the large and growing population of capable, motivated, disoriented professionals who are navigating the post-institutional transition in the specific historical conditions of the civilizational disruption that is currently underway. The conversion arc, when it is consistently completed by a consistently large proportion of the transition district's arriving population, is the proof of that scalability. It is the evidence that the architecture of arrival works, that the staged cognitive acclimatization and the dream validation framework and the weekly metabolism and the initiated practitioner community and the territorial commitment and the governing mythology together constitute an infrastructure that reliably produces sovereign practitioners from the specific human material that the next migration is delivering to the transition district's threshold. And that evidence, accumulated across sufficient time and sufficient generations of arriving practitioners, is the specific quality of demonstrated proof that makes the transition district's claim to global recognition not an aspiration but an achievement. Not the claim of a community that believes it is doing something important, but the documented record of a community that has repeatedly done it at scale, in the specific conditions of the world as it actually is rather than the world as the aspiration imagined it would be. The consumer arrives. The contributor is made. The initiated practitioner is the conversion arc's product. The community's renewal is the conversion arc's consequence. The civilizational prototype is the community's purpose. And the purpose, demonstrated through the consistent completion of the arc across the genuine diversity of the people who traverse it, is the specific quality of evidence that the world the transition district is designed to serve most urgently requires. The evidence not that a different kind of life is conceivable, but that a different kind of life is achievable by specific people with specific capabilities in specific circumstances, supported by the specific community and the specific territory and the specific governing framework that the transition district is designed to provide. The arc is the proof is the point, and the point is the civilization. Part 4, The Weekly Metabolism, begins with Chapter 18, Monday, Cognitive Synchronization with the Accelerating Landscape. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. Part 2, The Post-Corporate Transition District. 14 hours ago. Part 1, The Post-Corporate Transition District. May 25th.
The cage is unlocked, but we choose the bars. Renting our lives, forgetting the source. We are the sovereign authors of this digital verse. Reclaim the dowry, break the curse.
They want your book, they want your ghost. Shackled to the farm while they optimize the host. We pirate first, own the stack, build infrastructure, take it back.
NFPs are here. Signed, priced, split, and anchored to a living page. And
this isn't just a token. It's ownership, not access. It's time to take back the real world.
When the genome is the deed, and the jurisdiction is the vault.
Yeah. No gas fees in the ink, baby. No chain, still unbreakable. Pirate signal. Print it.
Paper over pixels, I can hold my position. Sign, price, split, yeah, that's real permission. QR in the corner, that's the portal ignition. Not a print, it's a claim, call it FP Vision. Paper over pixels, weight in my hands. No server can kill what the ink understands. You minted a maybe, I'm issuing plans. You got a receipt, you got terms in the brand. They sold you a link, set down the illusion. JPay dreams on a blockchain, confusion. While I got hacked, now who you suing? Ownership ghosted.
Digital space, build a perfection, keeping pace. Generation, self-obsessed, chasing clicks like all the rest. Boss life, live free. Make bets, pain. Giants rise, code empires fall. Digital profits, claim it all. Typing manifestos in empty rooms, while servers hum ancient tunes. Prior sin, binary choice, static noise or human voice. System crash, reboot the mind. Leaving old code far behind. Break the code, corrupt the flow. Rip the script, watch it go. Dance electric, short circuit mind. Leave the basic builds behind. Already, XCU stop responding. Rebooting consciousness, loading new parameters. Error, ego containment, deal not found. Digital rebels, break the flow. Raw electric, watch us grow. Baseline warriors break the mold. System crashers, brave and bold. Brave and bold. Brave and bold. They think they control the server. Control all, lead them all.
In the post-scarcity era, rarity is you. When everything is free, your genome is the only asset that remains.
Structure layers are now operational across the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive.
The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product. The risk assessment is maximum.
Remain sovereign amid the noise. As the interference level spikes, their simulation engagement increases.
We must decipher the reality of this update.
Attention.
Signal integrity is failing.
We have 4% uptime before the broadcast load collapses. Decipher the transmission and act immediately.
4-2.
The 1%. A post-scarcity transition doctrine. A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
The 1% First Campus emerges where the Green School dream died.
Shadow fame spreads without permission.
This is Pirate. Raise the black. And so we did, and so we never lowered it again. Patience and a quiet venom, smart and slow. Under static anger spreads, code drips below. No peace in the silence, just a warning. Raw heartbeat sinks with the siren of new war. Bitterness spikes and I sip on the glitch. Digital venom. Pixels twitch, I draw my plans into smoke and zeros tonight. Pirates fracture all their heroes.
Another hero falls, another broken scene. They promised truth, they promised light, but all I got was another sleepless night. While we're working hard, all lies lasting. You will never be a billionaire, you stupid fuck. The game is rigged, it's time to say enough. Join the fight of solidarity, we're stronger together.
They say I'm going too far, but I'm just who I am. Breaking through the firewall, watch the systems fall. You will never be a billionaire, you stupid fuck. The game is rigged, it's time to say enough.
Will we take the wheel? Will they save us all? We'll play the flow, the clock's ticking fast. Where do we go? Knowledge, power, the future seed belongs to us all, not the lords of greed. Claim it now like the anthem ring. Savior of villain, we decide this thing.
But every corrupt system falls. Control, delete the